La 10 190e séance du Conseil de sécurité reprend. Je rappelle aux orateurs qu'ils sont priés de limiter la durée de leurs interventions à 3 minutes maximum afin que le Conseil puisse mener ses travaux dans les meilleurs délais. Le voyant rouge de leur micro se mettra à clignoter au bout de 3 minutes pour les inviter à conclure. Je donne maintenant la parole à la représentante de la Pologne.
Madame la Présidente, je remercie la République démocratique du Congo d'avoir convoqué ce débat, ainsi que les intervenantes, la représentante spéciale Madame Pramila Patten et la directrice Madame Carine Jocelyn pour les présentations éclairantes. La Pologne s'associe aux déclarations qui seront prononcées par l'Union européenne et par le Canada au nom du groupe des Amis des femmes, de la paix et de la sécurité. Permettez-moi d'ajouter quelques observations à titre national. Conflict-related sexual violence is not an inevitable byproduct of war. It is a crime under international law, deliberate, preventable, and punishable. Yet the Secretary General's latest report documents a sharp rise in verified cases, marked by extreme brutality and directed mainly against women and girls, while also affecting men and boys, particularly in detention settings. Behind every statistic stands a survivor to whom international law has made a promise. Today, we must ask ourselves whether we are keeping that promise. Madam President, this year, for the first time, a permanent member of this Council, the Russian Federation, has been listed in the annex to the Secretary General's report among parties credibly suspected of committing or being responsible for patterns of conflict-related sexual violence. United Nations monitors have verified hundreds of cases of conflict-related sexual violence committed by Russian armed and security forces against detained Ukrainian civilians and prisoners of war, including rape, genital mutilation, forced nudity, and acts of torture involving electric shocks and beatings to the genitals. No seat at this table confers immunity. Those responsible at every level of command must be held accountable. Poland supports the Secretary General's call on the Russian Federation to immediately cease all acts of sexual violence, issue clear order chains of command, investigate all credible allegations, and grant unimpeded access for monitoring and the provision of services to survivors in areas and detention facilities under its control. At the same time, Ukraine demonstrates that the promise of international law can be upheld even amid ongoing aggression. Its 2025 law on urgent interim reparations for survivors, the first of its kind adopted during an active armed conflict, sets a new global benchmark. Poland was proud to co-sponsor the presentation of this legislation at the Human Rights Council and to co-host, 2 weeks ago, the Ukraine Recovery Conference, which placed reparations for survivors firmly on the recovery agenda. We encourage partners to close the funding gap so that survivors receive redress now rather than in an uncertain future. Madam President, allow me to make 3 brief points. First, impunity must carry a cost. Sanctions committees should make consistent use of conflict-related sexual violence as a designation criterion, supported by dedicated expertise within their monitoring groups. Second, responses must be survival-centered. Survivors are co-creators of solutions, not passive beneficiaries. Their meaningful participation in policymaking, in line with Security Council Resolution 2467, should become standard practice alongside comprehensive assistance, including for children born of wartime rape. Third, the mandate requires adequate resources. Poland has supported the Office of the Special Representative financially and encourages others to do the same. As the United Nations undergoes institutional reform, Poland will continue to advocate for strengthening this mandate and the specialized expertise it has built, including the work of the team of experts on the rule of law and sexual violence in conflict, in advancing justice and accountability. Women's protection advisors and support for women-led organizations are equally indispensable to prevention, monitoring, and response, and must not become casualties of these organizations' financial crisis. Survivors have kept their part of the promise by speaking out, often at great personal risk. It is now time for this Council and this organization to keep ours. I thank you.
Je remercie la représentante de la Pologne pour sa déclaration et je donne maintenant la parole au représentant de l'Autriche.
Thank you, Madam President. Dear Foreign Minister Therese Kaiguamba-Wagner, allow me to thank you and the Democratic Republic of the Congo for convening this open debate. And I also want to thank the briefers, especially SRSG, Pramila, Patten, for their important insights. Austria aligns itself with the statements of the European Union and the Group of Friends of Women, Peace and Security. We're deeply alarmed by the escalation in the volume and brutality of conflict-related sexual violence reflected in the Secretary General's report. Madam President, allow me to highlight some of Austria's priorities in this context, including during our upcoming Security Council term. First, strengthening protection. Austria will continue to advocate for full respect for international humanitarian law and the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2467. Priority must be to ensure safe, timely and non-discriminatory access to essential services for victims and survivors, including medical care, psychosocial support and legal assistance. Second, advancing accountability. Impunity remains a principal driver of conflict-related sexual violence. To advance accountability for these crimes, cooperation among prosecutors and practitioners and enhancing national capacities are vital. Austria has joined the CRSV prosecution network as a co-financing partner. We equally underscore the importance of the monitoring, analysis and reporting arrangements, MARA, and the Secretary General's annual report for documenting violations and identifying patterns. Third, translating commitments into actions. The team of experts has demonstrated measurable results in strengthening investigations, prosecutions, and justice responses to conflict-related sexual violence. Austria remains committed to supporting the team's operational work through the financing of projects, including in Ukraine and South Sudan, with the aim to advance national efforts to deliver justice for victims and survivors. Last but not least, participation. As numbers have shown, the positive effect of women's participation on conflict prevention and conflict resolution, we will uphold our shared commitments regarding the full, equal, meaningful, and safe participation of women at all levels. Madam President, Austria will continue to support the prevention of conflict-related sexual violence and strengthen the rule of law during our Council term. I thank you.
Je remercie le représentant de l'Autriche et je donne maintenant la parole au représentant du Luxembourg.
Merci Madame la Présidente, Madame la Ministre. Le Luxembourg souscrit aux déclarations de l'Union européenne et du groupe des Amis des femmes et de la paix et de la sécurité. Nous remercions la République démocratique du Congo pour l'organisation de ce débat. Nous exprimons notre reconnaissance à la représentante spéciale du secrétaire général, Pramila Patten, pour son engagement et pour la présentation du rapport annuel sur les violences sexuelles liées au conflit. Madame Patten, nous réitérons ici notre plein soutien à votre mandat et au travail crucial de vos équipes qui opèrent dans un contexte difficile, marqué par l'intensification des conflits armés, les restrictions continues de l'accès humanitaire et une régression du respect des droits humains, en particulier des droits des femmes et des filles. Comme le souligne le rapport du secrétaire général, le nombre de cas de violences sexuelles liées à des conflits ayant été confirmés par l'ONU en 2025 a fortement augmenté par rapport à 2024. Chaque violence sexuelle a des conséquences dévastatrices pour les victimes, femmes et hommes, filles et garçons, pour leurs familles et pour leur communauté. Pour reconnaître le courage des victimes, le Luxembourg a organisé avec ses partenaires du Benelux le lancement de l'exposition Thinking of You en marge de la 70e session de la Commission de la condition de la femme en mars dernier. Madame la Présidente, le Luxembourg souhaite mettre l'accent sur 3 points. D'abord, l'impunité ne doit jamais être tolérée. Elle crée un terreau propice à la répétition des violences. Il était indispensable de disposer de systèmes judiciaires capables de prévenir, d'enquêter sur les violences sexuelles et d'en poursuivre les auteurs de façon efficace. Nous appuyons la recommandation faite par le secrétaire général aux États membres de s'inspirer des dispositions législatives types afin de renforcer les cadres législatifs nationaux et de garantir une meilleure protection des droits humains de toutes et tous, y compris des victimes et des personnes rescapées. Ensuite, nous encourageons les États membres à veiller à ce que les besoins et les intérêts des survivants et des survivantes figurent au cœur des politiques. Leur accès aux soins de santé, aux services psychologiques et à l'aide judiciaire doit être facilité sans discrimination et sans entrave afin de ne pas aggraver leur traumatisme. Pour sa part, le Luxembourg appuie des actions visant à répondre aux besoins des victimes et des survivantes de violences sexuelles au Sud Kivu, en République démocratique du Congo, avec des partenaires aussi de la société civile. Enfin, nous appelons les parties au conflit listés dans l'annexe du rapport du secrétaire général à coopérer pleinement avec la représentante spéciale du secrétaire général et à traduire les responsables en justice. Nous les appelons à respecter pleinement leurs obligations au regard du droit international humanitaire, à mettre fin immédiatement aux violences sexuelles et à garantir un accès humanitaire sûr et sans entrave, que ce soit en Ukraine, au Myanmar, au Soudan, en Israël et dans le territoire palestinien occupé ou dans d'autres situations. Je vous remercie.
Je remercie le représentant du Luxembourg et je donne maintenant la parole au représentant de la République de Corée.
Thank you, Madam President. At the outset, I have to begin by thanking DRC presidents for convening this timely open debate. The reason is that, having attended CRSV-related meetings and side events here in New York, I had opportunity to listen directly to the testimonies of CRSV survivors. Their accounts made me realize the gravity of this issue and reinforced my conviction that it requires more urgent response from the international community. Likewise, guided by the poignant weight of its own history and solidarity with all victims everywhere, the Republic of Korea is gravely concerned by the sharp global rise in conflict-related sexual violence. Indeed, as hauntingly presented in the SG report, there has been a disturbing upsurge of cases of conflict-related sexual violence during the reporting period all around the world. The suffering inflicted by CRSVE is real. At the same time, this shocking rise of CRSV is transpiring amidst an international system already facing other acute crises. Many member states made similar points related with CRSV during morning sessions. But allow me to highlight the following key points again. First, with the support for survivors abruptly reduced in today's era of mass humanitarian funding cuts, an inherently survivor-centered approach is essential to ensure that we leave no one behind. As I said in the beginning, my government is well aware that survivors face a long road to recovery, elevated social stigmas, and difficult rehabilitation back into societies, making them vulnerable to further abuse and exploitations. Thus, it is integral to now collectively revitalize the prevention and response architecture under Security Council Resolution 1888. Second, all parties must comply with universal obligations under international humanitarian law and international human rights law. Notably, this includes the immediate cessation of the scourge of CRSV, ensuring humanitarian access, including critically at prisons and detention sites, and holding all perpetrators accountable. Impunity for its violation only paves the way for perpetrators to continue committing heinous crimes. Third, it is essential to restore honor and dignity of all CRSV victims and redouble collective efforts to heal their lasting wounds. As a country, with a painful historical experience of comfort women, the WPS agenda is a particularly close and vital issue for Korea to this day. We remain committed to restoring the honor and dignity of the comfort women victims and to healing their psychological wounds. In this context, under the Action with Women and Peace initiative, my government continues to strongly support peace activists and sexual violence survivors in difficult conflict situations, alongside faithful cooperation with the UN SRSG on sexual violence in conflict at the global level. Madam President, CRSV victims deserve protection. They deserve rights. They deserve survivor-centered support, and they deserve accountability. The Republic of Korea will continue to amplify their powerful voices down the road. Thank you, Madam President.
Je remercie le représentant de la République de Corée et je donne maintenant la parole au représentant d'Israël.
Thank you, Madam President. Today's debate is about making sure that international law protects survivors of sexual violence in conflict zones. It is about preventing these crimes, holding perpetrators accountable, and putting survivors first. Israel takes that responsibility seriously. But none of this is possible without evidence, without fairness, without truth. And that is why I cannot stay silent as Ms. Pramila Patten briefs this Council on a report that contains baseless allegations against Israel. 6 weeks ago, Israel's armed and security forces were added to the Secretary General's blacklist. Israel, a democracy governed by the rule of law, placed alongside Boko Haram, alongside ISIS, alongside Hamas, alongside the same terrorists that used sexual violence on October 7th and against our hostages in captivity. That is not accountability. It is a moral disgrace. But, Madam President, we all know what really happened here. Let's admit it. Last year, after months of delay, Hamas was finally and rightly placed on the Secretary General's blacklist. Immediately after that, in the name of balance, the anti-Israel forces inside the UN decided that Israel had to be added too, to make a balance. And instead of standing up to that pressure, Ms. Pramila Patten gave into it. She caved to the Secretary General. She was not a bystander in this shameful process. She gave it credibility. She defended it. And when asked whether she had seen the evidence with her own eyes, she answered, and I quote, "No, because this is not my job." She also said, and I quote, "It is not the responsibility of my office to do any verification." So, Ms. Patten, let us understand this clearly. You put Israel on a damaging UN blacklist. You defended the decision before the world, but you say verifying the allegation was not your job. Then whose job was it? Who should verify it? You were supposed to be independent. Instead, you became part of the campaign. Ms. Patten, you are not a bystander. You are a collaborator. The truth is simple. Israel cooperated with you repeatedly. We opened our doors so you could pursue your mandate. You came to Israel after October 7th. You met everyone. You saw the evidence with your own eyes. You knew the issues. And about this year, I myself met with you twice this past year. I came to your office in September and again in February. We built trust with your team. And trust does not come easily to us in this building. After we saw what happened with UN Women, after what happened with the Commission of Inquiry, bodies that let us down again and again, recycling blood libels and Hamas talking points. But with you and your team, we believed it was different. We really thought we developed a professional working relationship. You were scheduled to visit Israel twice. Twice you canceled. And then without presenting the specific cases to us, you blacklisted Israel anyway. Your mandate requires a pattern. So show us a pattern. Your report cites 31 alleged cases involving Israel across 3 years, including 13 cases in 2025. 13 alleged cases in 2025. Now, compare that with the rest of your own report. I'll give you a few examples. The Central African Republic, 10,385 cases. The Democratic Republic of the Congo, 1,534 cases. And still Israel, with 13 alleged cases, was fast-tracked onto the blacklist. No clear threshold, no consistent standard, no proof of a pattern. So today we have to ask why. Why Israel? Why the rush? The answer is clear. It is because the Secretary General wanted Israel on that list. That is the answer. This is the perfect final chapter of Mr. Guterres' legacy as outgoing Secretary General. For years, he has tried to create false moral equivalence between Israel and the terrorists who seek our destruction. Now, in his final months, he has done it again. He has tried to place the state of Israel in the same moral category as Hamas. So let us call this what it is. It is a shameful lie, a campaign, and a political theater. Ms. Patten, I have a challenge for you before this council. If we are wrong, if I'm wrong today, prove it. If you have nothing to hide, show us. Prove that the decision was not fast-tracked, no pressure from the SG's office. Prove that there was no political pressure. In the interest of transparency, release your communications with the SG. Any credible institutions, any credible government, we know about transparency. Show this council how the decision was really made. Who made the phone call? If you have nothing to hide, Ms. Patten, why don't you today open your phone, show us the email, show us the text that led to that shameful decision. We know it. You know it. This listing was not your professional judgment. It is the Secretary General's political tool. He pressured you and you caved. It did not have to be this way. I don't know if you remember, my colleagues, if you remember Ms. Alice Indiritu, the UN's former special advisor on the prevention of genocide. If you don't, let me remind you about what happened to her. She faced the same pressure from the same people, from the same floor. The Secretary General demanded from her that she call Israel's self-defense in Gaza a genocide. That's what he wanted her to say in a report. She told him no. She refused. She knew her mandate. She knew genocide requires proof of intent. And she wouldn't make a false accusation against Israel just to satisfy a political campaign. Then what happened to her? In her own words, and I quote what she said, "I was hounded, day in, day out, bullied, hounded, with protection from nobody. Threats from inside the UN. a coordinated campaign to remove her from office. She paid with her job, but she kept her integrity. You faced the same bullies, Ms. Patten. Ms. Indirutu stood her ground. You fell in line. And if you stand for nothing, Ms. Patten, what will you fall for? And for what? Your tenure ends in December. You traded your integrity, your credibility, your reputation for a few more months on a UN salary. Perhaps one day, when the Secretary General is no longer pulling the strings in this building, you will finally find your own voice, and you will share the truth about what happened, how this decision was made. You will release the emails. You will reveal the pressure. You will admit what really happened. Ms. Patten, history is full of bureaucrats who later claimed they had no choice, but you had a choice. You could have refused. You could have defended the independence of your mandate. You could have resigned. You failed to do so then. You should resign now. You tried to stain Israel, but the stain is not on Israel. The stain is on you.
Je remercie le représentant d'Israël pour sa déclaration et je donne maintenant la parole au représentant de Liechtenstein.
Thank you so much for the floor, Madam President. Madam President, the Secretary General's latest report evidences the shocking scale, brutality, and perseverance of conflict-related sexual violence. Verified cases have more than doubled in 2025, reaching their highest levels since reporting began 16 years ago. The annex to the report now lists 77 parties to conflict, credibly suspected of committing these crimes, more than 65% of which are repeat perpetrators. This year's report not only documents a significant increase in verified cases, but also changes in pattern of conflict-related sexual violence. It highlights the use of digital technologies to threaten, exploit, and silence survivors, as well as growing pressure on humanitarian access, monitoring, and survivor assistance. At the same time, and as the Special Representative has underlined, the figures are an indication of the dangerous pattern of violations that remain widely underreported. Women's protection advisors, whose work consists in monitoring and engaging with conflict parties, remain crucial for the adequate documentation of these crimes. Liechtenstein regrets that these specialists are not deployed to all conflict-affected situations covered in the report, even though their deployment is mandated by the Security Council. In light of the unprecedented rise in verified violations, it is deplorable that the current budgetary crisis risks having a detrimental impact on the safety of women affected by armed conflict. While women and girls continue to be disproportionately affected, the report illustrates that men and boys are also subject to these crimes, particularly in detention settings. Most of the Ukrainian and Palestinian victims of conflict-related sexual violence, for instance, are men and boys, subject to sexual torture, rape, and other forms of violence during imprisonment. Based on the verified information available, the perpetrators of these crimes, Russian armed and security forces, as well as Israeli armed and security forces, were listed for the first time as parties to conflict, credibly suspected of using sexual violence in situations of armed conflict. Many male survivors of such violence face profound stigma that discourages reporting and limits access to specialized support. In this regard, we commend the pioneering work of the Liechtenstein-based All Survivors Project Foundation on conflict-related sexual violence against men and boys. In collaboration with partner organizations across Ukraine, the All Survivors Project has, for example, helped to ensure that survivors can access the necessary support services, including health providers and the justice system. Such initiatives constitute important steps to recognize the full spectrum of survivors of CRSV and ensure that their needs are met. Madam President, over the past 2 decades, the Security Council has developed a comprehensive framework for the prevention of and response to conflict-related sexual violence. The International Criminal Court has continuously made vital contributions to the work of the Security Council by promoting accountability for rape, sexual slavery, enforced prostitution, forced pregnancy, enforced sterilization, and other forms of sexual violence. These crimes are respectively recognized as war crimes and crimes against humanity under the Rome Statute. Madam President, the SG's report provides also examples of additional progress. In Colombia, the Special Jurisdiction for Peace continues to advance accountability, including through landmark decisions on command responsibility for sexual violence. In Ukraine, sustained international support has strengthened national capacities to investigate and prosecute these crimes. And in Syria, the establishment of transitional justice institutions offers an opportunity to integrate accountability for conflict-related sexual violence. In order to preserve the progress, it is essential to maintain effective monitoring, specialized expertise, and sustained support for survivors, as well as accountability mechanisms. I thank you so much, Madam President.
Je remercie le représentant du Liechtenstein pour sa déclaration et je donne maintenant la parole au représentant de l'Inde.
Madam President, at the outset, I congratulate the Democratic Republic of Congo for assuming the presidency of the Council for this month. I also take this opportunity to thank SRSG Pramila Patten and the briefer for her insights. Today's open debate is on a subject that warrants collective deliberation by member states, particularly in the wake of findings of the UNSG's report on conflict-related sexual violence that corroborates a sharp increase in verified cases in 2025 and the extreme brutality involved. Sexual violence continues to be used as a means of war, of terrorism, torture, and political repression to subjugate communities, suppress dissent, and inflict human suffering. This continues amid a thriving culture of impunity. We strongly condemn such heinous acts. Madam President, conflict-related sexual violence devastates women individually and creates inerasable scars on the spirit of the human ecosystems around them. Beyond physical harm, the psychological trauma and social isolation that follows demand carefully designed interventions for the rehabilitation and reintegration of survivors. Addressing this scourge, therefore, calls for a multifaceted national approach aimed towards deterring and prosecuting such crimes and ensuring delivery of justice to the victims. Madam President, in India's experience, deployment of women peacekeepers is a proven measure with transformative impact in addressing CRSV. The first ever all-women formed police unit of the UN deployed by India to Liberia in 2007 was instrumental in creating an environment for addressing criminality, deterring sexual and gender-based violence, and in helping to rebuild safety and confidence among people. The unique perspective brought by female peacekeepers also strengthens systems to deter CRSV. In this context, I'd like to highlight the contribution of Major Moiz Yassin, who as force ombudsperson and welfare officer in UNMISS, built an accessible, confidential, and victim-centered channel for informal grievance reporting. She conducted over 40 tailored sessions across troop and police contributing countries and military observers, and also established a force gender database for evidence-based gender-responsive planning. Another example is Major Sonia Devendra Nevaskar, the focal point for uniformed women and a member of the UNMISS Gender Task Force. She worked actively towards the intelligence and planning functions for CRSV prevention, built UNPOL military best practice networks, and engaged the host nation on gender issues. I'm happy to report that both Major Moiz Yassin and Major Sonia are being awarded the 2026 Military Gender Advocate of the Year recognition certificate by the UN Secretary General for their remarkable efforts. They follow in the illustrious footsteps of peacekeepers from India who have been similarly honored in 2019, 2024, and 2025. Madam President, our international efforts to combat CRSV flow from our domestic policy based on a three-pronged approach to eliminate violence against women. This includes, first, creating an environment that fosters women's safety. Second, effective implementation of legislation to safeguard it. And third, infrastructure that supports women in distress. Guided by this approach, we have instituted a pan-India helpline, 181 for women in distress, operational across the country. India has also rolled out the Safe City project in major cities to create an environment of safety for women in public spaces. Women help desks have been established in police stations nationwide, and over 900 Sakhi one-stop centers have been established across the country for women in distress. They offer shelter and medical, legal, psychological support for them under one roof so that they receive the care, comfort, and protection they need. India's penal code was also revamped by introducing stringent provisions in criminal law for violence against women, including enhanced penalties for sexual offenses and instituting survivor-centric procedures to safeguard the dignity and rights of victims. Fast-track special courts have been set up to ensure efficient investigation and prosecution of offenders. These efforts are also underpinned by the Nirbhaya Fund with a corpus of nearly $930 million specifically dedicated for initiatives on women's safety. Madam President, in closing, I'd like to underscore that India remains committed to working with the UN and the wider membership to share our experience and assistance to ensure that women remain protected and survivors receive the justice they deserve across the world. Thank you, Madam President.
Je remercie le représentant de l'Inde pour sa déclaration et je donne maintenant la parole au représentant de la Lituanie.
Thank you, Madam President. Lithuania aligns itself with the EU statement and the statement of Group of Friends of Women, Peace and Security, and would like to add the following remarks in its national capacity. We thank the Democratic Republic of the Congo for convening this timely debate. We reaffirm our strong support for the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict, Pramila Patten, whose leadership is indispensable in driving accountability, strengthening prevention, and ensuring that survivors remain at the center of our collective response. Conflict-related sexual violence continues to be perpetrated with alarming scale, brutality, and impunity across multiple settings, from Haiti and the Central African Republic to Sudan, Myanmar, and beyond. These crimes are deliberately used to terrorize populations, forcibly displace communities, and perpetuate violence. Lithuania remains deeply concerned by these trends and underscores the need for consistent attention to all situations guided by international law and a survivor-centered approach. All parties identified in the Secretary General's report must end these violations, prevent their recurrence, grant full UN access, and cooperate with accountability mechanisms. At the same time, we must not overlook Ukraine in the context of Russia's ongoing war of aggression. The report documents patterns of sexual violence in detention and temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine, often used as a form of torture, including against prisoners of war and civilian detainees. Notably, many verified cases concern men, highlighting that victims include all genders, particularly in detention settings. Lithuania welcomes listing of Russian armed and security forces in the annex of the report for the first time. This designation carries particular gravity given that Russia is a permanent member of the Security Council, entrusted with the maintenance of international peace and security. Its listening underscores the urgent need to ensure that no state, regardless of its status, is beyond scrutiny of or accountability under international law. Accountability must extend not only to direct perpetrators, but also to those exercising command responsibility who order, enable, or fail to prevent such crimes. Conflict-related sexual violence is not an inevitable byproduct of war. It is a crime that must be investigated and prosecuted regardless of the perpetrator's rank or affiliation. Madam President, the report reminds us that the figures we see represent only a fraction of reality. Survivors continue to face stigma, trauma, fear of reprisals, and significant access constraints, particularly in detention facilities and occupied territories. It demands sustained political will to ensure access, strengthen monitoring mechanisms, and fully resource protection efforts, including the deployment of women's protection advisors. Lithuania reaffirms and recognizes the important work of UN Action Against Sexual Violence in Conflict, whose interagency efforts have helped translate global commitment into tangible support for survivors and strengthen national capacities. Upholding international humanitarian and human rights law requires more than commitments. It requires action. Survivors must see justice delivered, perpetrators must be held to account, and impunity must end. Lithuania will continue to work with partners to advance these principles. I thank you.
Je remercie le représentant de la Lituanie pour sa déclaration et je donne maintenant la parole au représentant du Guatemala.
Señora Presidenta, Guatemala agradece a la Presidencia de la República Democrática del Congo por la convocatoria a este debate abierto. Reafirmamos la importancia de mantener la violencia sexual relacionada con los conflictos en la agenda del Consejo de Seguridad y destacamos el valor del mandato de la representante especial del Secretario General sobre la violencia sexual en los conflictos como un mecanismo para fortalecer la prevención, la protección de las víctimas y la respuesta coordinada del sistema de las Naciones Unidas. Agradecemos asimismo las valiosas intervenciones de las ponentes que nos recuerdan que detrás de cada estadística hay personas, familias y comunidades profundamente afectadas. Nos convocan a redoblar nuestros esfuerzos para evitar que estas violaciones continúen ocurriendo. La experiencia demuestra que la acción de las Naciones Unidas puede generar resultados concretos cuando se trabaja en estrecha coordinación con las instituciones nacionales. Mediante marcos de cooperación acordados y en consonancia con las resoluciones de este Consejo. En Guatemala, ese acompañamiento ha contribuido a avances históricos en materia de justicia transicional para mujeres sobrevivientes de violencia sexual durante el conflicto armado interno. Casos como Sepur Zarco y el de las mujeres Maya Achí constituyen precedentes que evidencian la importancia de fortalecer las capacidades nacionales para investigar estos crímenes, sancionar a los responsables y evitar que las sobrevivientes sean revictimizadas durante todas las fases del proceso. Para avanzar hacia la erradicación de la violencia sexual relacionada con los conflictos, es indispensable reforzar el respeto y la aplicación de los derechos humanos y del derecho internacional humanitario. Guatemala hace un llamado a todas las partes en conflicto a cumplir plenamente con sus obligaciones internacionales y a adoptar medidas eficaces para proteger a la población civil, en particular a las mujeres y las niñas. El respeto de estas normas constituye la base para prevenir nuevas violaciones, fortalecer el Estado de Derecho y consolidar una paz sostenible. Como señaló el presidente Arévalo durante la Semana de la Consolidación de la Paz, alcanzar la paz no significa cerrar un capítulo de la historia, sino una tarea constante de la democracia. Muchas gracias.
Je remercie le représentant du Guatemala pour sa déclaration et je donne maintenant la parole au représentant de l'Arabie saoudite.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. بداية أود أن أرحب بمشاركة معالي رئيسة الوزراء السيدة جوديث سومينوا تولوكا، كما نهنئ جمهورية الكونغو الديمقراطية على توليها رئاسة مجلس الأمن لهذا الشهر وعلى تنظيم هذا الحدث المهم، والشكر موصول لجمهورية كولومبيا على رئاستها المجلس الشهر الماضي، كما نقدم جزيل الشكر لمقدمي الإحاطات على إحاطاتهم القيمة. السيد الرئيس، السيدات والسادة، ينعقد اجتماعنا اليوم في وقت لا يزال فيه العنف الجنسي يستخدم في العديد من النزاعات المسلحة كسلاح وأداة للقمع والترهيب والتهجير، مستهدفا المدنيين ولا سيما النساء والأطفال في انتهاك جسيم للقانون الدولي الإنساني والقانون الدولي لحقوق الإنسان. وقد أكد مجلس الأمن منذ اعتماده القرار 1820 في عام 2008 وما تلاه من قرارات ذات صلة أن العنف الجنسي المرتبط بالنزاعات المسلحة يشكل تهديداً جسيماً للأمن والسلم الدوليين ويستنجب محاسبة مرتكبيه وضمان عدم الإفلات من العقاب. ومن هذا المنطلق فإن التصدي لهذه الجريمة يمثل مسؤولية جماعية تتقاسمها الدول وجميع الأطراف المعنية، وتتطلب جهوداً متسقة لمعالجة أسبابها والحد من تداعياتها وضمان حماية المدنيين ودعم الضحايا. السيد الرئيس، تؤكد بلادي التزامها الثابت والراسخ بمبادئ القانون الدولي الإنساني والقانون الدولي لحقوق الإنسان انطلاقا من التزاماتها القانونية ومسؤولياتها الإنسانية والأخلاقية. كما تولي المملكة أهمية خاصة لاحترام وحماية المدنيين من الانتهاكات المتصلة بالعنف الجنسي في مناطق النزاع، تأكيدا لقيم الشريعة الإسلامية ومبادئها السامية. كما تدعم المملكة بشكل خاص أحكام اتفاقيات جنيف بهذا الشأن، وتؤكد على وجوب التزام جميع الأطراف النزاعات المسلحة بهذه الاتفاقيات، وتدعو إلى تعزيز آليات تنفيذ القانون الدولي الإنساني. وعليه تدين المملكة كافة الانتهاكات على المدنيين، وتشدد على أهمية محاسبة مرتكبي تلك الانتهاكات وضمان تقديم المساعدات الإنسانية إلى المتضررين دون عوائق. إن حماية الأشخاص من خطر العنف الجنسي خلال النزاع المسلح ليست فقط التزاما قانونيا يفرضه القانون الدولي الإنساني، بل هي في المقام الأول مسؤولية إنسانية وأخلاقية جماعية تقتضي منا جميعا العمل الجاد والفعال، حيث حرصت بلادي على دعم الجهود الدولية والإقليمية لحماية المتضررين في مختلف أنحاء العالم وتقديم مختلف أشكال الدعم الإنساني والإغاثي دون تمييز. وفي هذا السياق يواصل مركز الملك سلمان للإغاثة والأعمال الإنسانية دعم البرامج الإنسانية في الدول المتأثرة بالنزاعات، بما يسهم في توفير الحماية والرعاية للجميع، ويعزز الاستجابة لاحتياجات المتضررين بمن فيهم ضحايا العنف الجنسي بالتعاون مع الشركاء في المنظمات الدولية والإنسانية. السيد الرئيس، السيدات والسادة، ينص القانون الدولي على وجوب المعاملة الإنسانية للمدنيين الواقعين تحت سلطة طرف معاد دون أي تمييز، وحمايتهم من جميع أشكال العنف والمعاملة المهينة، بما في ذلك التعذيب والقتل. وتمتد هذه الحماية لتشمل النساء والأطفال والمسنين والمرضى والنازحين. وفي هذا السياق تؤكد المملكة أن ما يجري في الأراضي الفلسطينية من انتهاكات، بما في ذلك العنف الجنسي، يمثل انتهاكا صارخا للقانون الدولي الإنساني وللقيم الإنسانية المشتركة، وتدعو إلى تحرك دولي عاجل لوقف تلك الانتهاكات وضمان حماية المدنيين ومحاسبة المسؤولين عن هذه الانتهاكات. وفي الختام نؤكد أن الحماية من العنف الجنسي في مناطق النزاع المسلح تمثل التزاما قانونيا لا يجوز التنصل منه، ومسؤولية أخلاقية وإنسانية لا يمكن تجاهلها. كما تؤكد وقوفها إلى جانب كل جهد أممي يسعى إلى حماية المدنيين وتحقيق الأمن والاستقرار للشعوب المتضررة من العنف الجنسي في النزاعات. كما تؤكد على أهمية تعزيز التعاون الدولي للتصدي والاستجابة لمعاناة ضحايا العنف الجنسي المرتبطين بالنزاعات المسلحة أينما كانوا. وشكرا السيد الرئيس.
Je remercie le représentant de l'Arabie saoudite pour sa déclaration et je donne maintenant la parole à l'observateur permanent de l'État observateur de Palestine.
السيدة الرئيسة، اسمحي لي في البداية أن أتقدم بالشكر لوفدكم الموقر على عقد هذه الجلسة الهامة وعلى قيادة رئيسة وزراء بلادكم لها، مما يدل على الأهمية القصوى التي توليها بلادكم لقضية العنف الجنسي المرتبط بالنزاعات. وأتوجه أيضا بالشكر إلى السيدة براميلا باتن الممثلة الخاصة للأمين العام المعنية بالعنف الجنسي في حالات النزاع على إحاطتها الشاملة، وإلى الأمين العام على تقريره السنوي لعام 2026 بشأن العنف الجنسي المرتبط بالنزاعات، الذي يسلط الضوء على أحد أكثر الانتهاكات جسامة وأشدها أثراً على الضحايا ومجتمعاتهم. وندين في هذا السياق الهجوم الحقير والغير أخلاقي لممثل سلطة الاحتلال الإسرائيلي على الأمين العام وممثلته السيدة براميلا باتن لقيامهم بمهامهم في هذا الشأن بمهنية عالية وعدم رضوخهم للابتزاز والتشهير والضغوط الحقيرة والغير إنسانية. السيدة الرئيسة، لقد تلقينا بقلق بالغ تقرير الأمين العام الذي يوثق حالات تثبيت ارتكاب قوات الاحتلال الإسرائيلي لانتهاكات ذات طابع جنسي بحق الفلسطينيين تشمل أنفاطاً من التعذيب الجنسي والمعاملة المهينة للكرامة الإنسانية. فلقد شملت الحالات الموثقة نحو 31 ضحية فلسطينية، بما يشمل تعرض 14 رجلاً و7 نساء و9 أطفال ذكوراً وطفلة واحدة لأنماط من الاغتصاب، بما في ذلك الاغتصاب الجماعي ومحاولات الاغتصاب والتهديد بالاغتصاب والتفتيش الجسدي المهين والتعري القسري واستخدام العنف الجنسي كوسيلة تعذيب أو إذلال، سواء في السجون والمعتقلات الإسرائيلية والحواجز العسكرية والاجتياحات العسكرية للمدن والقرى والمخيمات الفلسطينية. كما نسب التقرير هذه الانتهاكات التي تم التحقق منها وفق المعايير الدولية التي وضعها مجلس الأمن في قراراته ذات الصلة إلى قوات الاحتلال الإسرائيلي ومصلحة السجون الإسرائيلية ووحدات أمنية وشرطية إسرائيلية. وفي هذا الصدد ترحب دولة فلسطين بقرار إدراج قوات الاحتلال الإسرائيلي للقائمة السوداء كمحطة أولى نحو تحقيق العدالة للضحايا الفلسطينيين ومحاسبة المسؤولين الإسرائيليين عن هذه الجرائم، خاصة في ظل تواطؤ الحكومة الإسرائيلية وغياب جهود تحقيق العدالة للضحايا وتوفير الحصانة لمرتكبي هذه الجرائم. وأبرز ما يدل على ذلك هو حادثة اغتصاب المعتقل الفلسطيني في سجن سيدي تيمان على يد قوات الاحتلال الإسرائيلي، والتي تم فيها إسقاط كافة التهم ضد هؤلاء المجرمين رغم التحقق من الحادثة وتوفر الأدلة والتقارير الطبية. السيدة الرئيسة، إن الانتهاكات الإسرائيلية ضد الضحايا الفلسطينيين التي وثقها التقرير ما هي إلا جزء قليل من حجم الحالات الحقيقي، فإن إسرائيل لا تتردد في استخدام العنف الجنسي كوسيلة حرب في قطاع غزة ووسيلة تهجير وترهيب في الضفة الغربية بما فيها القدس الشرقية، حيث يتعرض أبناء شعبنا خاصة في سجون الاحتلال لشتى أنواع التعذيب، ومنها التعذيب الجنسي بدون أي محاسبة. لذلك نجدد المطالبة من مجلسكم الموقر بضمان وصول هيئات الأمم المتحدة والآليات الدولية المختصة دون عوائق إلى كافة الأرض الفلسطينية المحتلة، بما يتيح إجراء الرصد والتحقق المستقل لكافة الحالات. ونطالبكم بتوفير الحماية الفورية للشعب الفلسطيني والإفراج عن كافة الأسرى والمعتقلين الفلسطينيين الذين يعانون أقصى أنواع التعذيب والمعاملة المهينة بما في ذلك الأطفال والنساء، وضمان حصول الناجين والناجيات على الرعاية الطبية والنفسية والاجتماعية وخدمات العدالة وجبر الضرر. إن القانون الدولي يفرض التزامات واضحة بحماية الكرامة الإنسانية ومنع التعذيب والمعاملة أو العقوبة القاسية أو اللا إنسانية أو المهينة، وأي انتهاك يثبت وقوعه يجب أن يواجه بالمساءلة والمحاسبة بصرف النظر عن هوية الجاني أو الضحية. سيد الرئيس، أن مصداقية الأمم المتحدة تستند إلى الالتزام بالحياد والموضوعية والاعتماد على الأدلة الموثقة، وهو ما يقضي دعم آليات الرصد والتحقيق وتمكينها من أداء ولايتها دون عوائق أو ضغوط أو تحريض أو تشويه. وفي هذا السياق ترفض دولة فلسطين حملة التشويش والتحريض التي تشنها إسرائيل ضد الأمين العام وممثليه بسبب قيامهم بمهامهم وفق الولاية التي أوكلت لهم من قبل مجلس الأمن. لا يمكن لإسرائيل أن تستمر بالتصرف وكأنها فوق القوانين، وأن المعايير الدولية لا تسري عليها، وأن إدانتها ما هو إلا خطأ في تطبيق المعايير أو انحياز ضدها وليس بسبب جرم صادر عنها. ختاماً، نجدد التأكيد على أن حماية المدنيين الفلسطينيين وصون كرامتهم الإنسانية وإنصافهم وضمان مساءلة مرتكبي الجرائم ضدهم ليست مجرد التزامات قانونية، بل مسؤولية أخلاقية تقع على عاتق هذا المجلس والمجتمع الدولي بأسره. وشكرا السيدة الرئيسة.
Je remercie l'observateur permanent de l'État observateur de Palestine pour sa déclaration et je donne maintenant la parole à la représentante de la Belgique.
Madame la Présidente, bienvenue à New York et je me joins à mes collègues pour vous féliciter pour votre présidence du Conseil. La Belgique s'aligne sur les déclarations de l'Union européenne et du groupe des Amis. Nous remercions votre pays d'avoir organisé ce débat ainsi que la représentante spéciale du secrétaire général, Madame Pramila Patten, et Madame Carine Jocelyn, représentant de la société civile, pour leur briefing. J'ai l'honneur de faire la déclaration suivante en ma capacité nationale. La Belgique est profondément alarmée par les conclusions du 17e rapport annuel du secrétaire général sur les violences sexuelles liées au conflit qui couvre 21 pays. Nous sommes particulièrement préoccupés par les liens croissants entre les violences sexuelles liées au conflit, le terrorisme, la criminalité organisée et les économies de la guerre, ainsi que par la vulnérabilité accrue des femmes et des filles déplacées ou réfugiées. Nous sommes également préoccupés par la persistance de ces violations. En effet, plus de 65% des parties inscrites dans les annexes y figurent depuis 5 ans ou davantage, sans avoir pris de mesures correctives significatives. Cela souligne l'urgence de renforcer les efforts de prévention, de mettre en œuvre des régimes de sanctions efficaces, de garantir un accès humanitaire sans entrave et d'assurer la pleine mise en œuvre de l'agenda du Conseil de sécurité sur les femmes, la paix et la sécurité. Le rapport inscrit pour la première fois les forces armées et de sécurité russes ainsi que les forces armées et de sécurité israéliennes pour violences sexuelles liées au conflit. Le rapport maintient le Hamas sur la liste. La Belgique condamne tous les actes de violence sexuelle liés au conflit et réaffirme son soutien indéfectible à la lutte contre l'impunité, à la justice pour les victimes et les survivants, ainsi qu'au plein respect du droit international. Nous appelons toutes les parties à respecter leurs obligations internationales et à mettre immédiatement fin à tout acte de violence sexuelle. Nous appelons ces parties à prendre et mettre en œuvre des engagements spécifiques assortis d'échéances précises pour coopérer pleinement avec la représentante spéciale du secrétaire général et les entités compétentes des Nations Unies et accorder un accès sans entrave aux fins du suivi et de la vérification. Le rapport montre également clairement que les besoins en assistance continuent à dépasser les ressources disponibles. À un moment où le système multilatéral est soumis à de fortes pressions, la Belgique réaffirme son ferme soutien au mandat de la représentante spéciale sur les violences sexuelles en période de conflit et salue le travail remarquable de Mme Patten. Nous nous félicitons également du rôle essentiel joué par l'équipe d'experts sur l'état de droit et les violences sexuelles liées au conflit qui accompagnent les autorités nationales dans le renforcement des cadres juridiques et des capacités d'enquête et de poursuite de ces crimes, notamment à travers des initiatives telles que le réseau pour les poursuites des violences sexuelles liées au conflit, lancé en mars 2026. Madame la Présidente, pour conclure, notre objectif doit être non seulement de documenter ces crimes et d'y répondre, mais aussi de les prévenir, de garantir que leurs auteurs, quels qu'ils soient, rendent des comptes et d'assurer aux survivants un accès durable à la justice, à la protection et aux services essentiels. Le cadre normatif existe déjà. Ce dont nous avons besoin à présent, c'est d'une mise en œuvre cohérente, de ressources adéquates et surtout de la volonté politique d'agir dans toutes les situations et sans exception. Je vous remercie.
Je remercie la représentante de la Belgique pour sa déclaration et je donne maintenant la parole au représentant de l'Allemagne.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente. Germany aligns itself with the statements to be delivered by the European Union and the Group of Friends of Women, Peace and Security. We thank the Democratic Republic of the Congo for convening this important debate, and we also thank today's briefers for their sobering reports. I would like to reiterate Germany's full support for Special Representative Pramila Patten and her team for their vital work in combating sexual violence in conflict. Her mandate is critical for working with governments on improving national capabilities to deal with sexual violence and ensuring justice for victims. We are deeply alarmed by the sharp escalation of verified CRSV cases in 2025. And yet, we have to recognize that the recorded figures represent only a fraction of global reality. A pervasive social stigma, fear of retaliation, and persistent impunity lead to underreporting. We strongly condemn Russia's widespread and systematic use of CRSV as a weapon of war and a tool of terror in its war of aggression against Ukraine, and welcome that this year's report lists the Russian Federation among the parties responsible for patterns of conflict-related sexual violence. We're also appalled by the atrocity, magnitude, and spread of conflict-related sexual violence in Sudan since the outbreak of the conflict and its use as a tactic to traumatize the civilian population. During and in the aftermath of the 7th of October terror attacks, Hamas committed horrific acts of sexual violence against civilians and hostages that we condemn in the strongest terms. We're also concerned by the increase in verified CRSV cases compared to 2024 in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. We call on all parties to conflict to comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law, to implement measures to ensure prevention and accountability, and to fully cooperate with the SRSG. Madam President, allow me to highlight two priorities for Germany in this regard. First, we must ensure accountability. If we don't, impunity dismantles the rule of law, fuels cycles of vengeance, and drives long-term regional instability. That is why we reaffirm our commitment to strengthen national and international criminal jurisdictions, such as the ICC. As donor to the SRSV Multi-Partner Trust Fund, Germany supports the work of the team of experts in, among others, Ukraine, Syria, and the DRC. And we also support the CRSV Prosecution Network, a global initiative to support national authorities in investigating and prosecuting this crime. Second, we have to focus more on a survivor-centered approach. Justice and psychosocial services must be firmly anchored in the rights, needs, and autonomy of survivors of CRSV. Therefore, we reiterate our commitment to a holistic model of survivor care based on Security Council Resolution 2467, care that includes medical and psychosocial support, legal aid, and long-term economic reintegration, while actively combating the stigmatization that too often silences victims. On this basis, we support civil society, organizations we work with, among others, in Syrian and Sudanese survivors. Madam President, we have a robust international legal framework to combat these atrocities, but we must urgently improve its implementation to put an end to such violence and to ensure accountability. Thank you very much.
Je remercie le représentant de l'Allemagne pour sa déclaration. Je donne maintenant la parole au représentant de l'Espagne.
Señora Presidenta, agradecemos la convocatoria de este debate abierto que pone de relieve la necesidad de seguir situando a las víctimas y supervivientes de violencia sexual en conflicto en el centro de nuestra acción colectiva contra esta lacra. Los datos del último informe del Secretario General sobre violencia sexual en conflicto son profundamente alarmantes. En 2025 se documentaron 9.788 casos de violencia sexual en conflicto, más del doble que el año anterior, lo que refleja un preocupante aumento en escala y gravedad en un contexto marcado por restricciones de acceso y limitaciones en las capacidades de respuesta. España condena de manera firme todos los actos de violencia sexual relacionada con los conflictos. Estos crímenes constituyen graves violaciones del derecho internacional humanitario y de los derechos humanos y en determinadas circunstancias pueden constituir crímenes de guerra. Debemos abordar esta lacra reforzando la prevención, promoviendo el respeto al derecho internacional humanitario y reforzando la protección de la población civil. Asimismo, es fundamental abordar las causas estructurales que facilitan estas violaciones, que incluyen la discriminación de género, la desigualdad, la exclusión de las mujeres en procesos de paz y en los espacios de poder y la impunidad. La política exterior feminista española, la estrategia de diplomacia humanitaria y el tercer plan de acción nacional incluyen este enfoque de prevención y respuesta a la violencia sexual en conflicto. España apoya todas las iniciativas que contribuyan a poner fin a la impunidad en la persecución de estos delitos históricamente relegados. En este contexto reiteramos nuestro apoyo a la Corte Penal Internacional como pilar en la lucha contra la impunidad por crímenes internacionales. Señora Presidenta, la acción contra la violencia sexual en conflicto, con un enfoque basado en la protección de las víctimas, estuvo en el centro de las discusiones sobre paz y seguridad en la Conferencia Ministerial sobre Política Exterior Feminista que organizó España el 2 y 3 de julio. En concreto, la declaración política adoptada incluyó como compromiso de los signatarios asegurar el acceso universal, integral y asequible a servicios de salud sexual y reproductiva, con inclusión en los contextos de conflicto armado, o el crear entornos libres de violencia para todas las mujeres y niñas, con financiación de planes de acción para eliminar todas las formas de violencia contra las mujeres, contemplando tanto el ámbito público como el privado. En relación a la protección, debemos prestar atención a las niñas y niños nacidos en violaciones en contextos de conflicto para combatir la estigmatización y facilitar su integración plena en las comunidades. El acompañamiento de las víctimas mediante medidas de reparación es importante para restablecer su dignidad y contribuir a la paz y a la justicia. Destacamos aquí la labor del Fondo Fiduciario de la CPI para las víctimas, que destina parte de sus programas de asistencia y reparación a víctimas de violencia sexual en situaciones de conflicto. España contribuye regularmente a este fondo con 300.000 euros en 2025. Por otro lado, España apoya el mandato de la representante especial del Secretario General para la Violencia Sexual en Conflicto. Su cometido es esencial para garantizar un seguimiento riguroso basado en hechos de la violencia sexual en conflicto, así como para apoyar, proteger y visibilizar a las víctimas. Nos preocupa la actual crisis de financiación humanitaria que está reduciendo las contribuciones a su oficina y a otros programas de protección y recuperación de los supervivientes. España seguirá apoyando con contribuciones regulares a la oficina de la representante especial del Secretario General. Por último, el informe del Secretario General pone de manifiesto que la violencia sexual se produce de forma recurrente en contextos de detención y privación de libertad. España subraya la importancia de garantizar el acceso de los mecanismos independientes de monitoreo en estos contextos. Señora Presidenta, España reitera su compromiso con un enfoque centrado en las víctimas de violencia sexual en conflicto, con el fortalecimiento de los mecanismos de Naciones Unidas, con una acción internacional coherente y basada en el derecho internacional. La respuesta de la comunidad internacional debe estar a la altura de la gravedad de estos crímenes: más prevención, más protección, más financiación, más participación de las mujeres y, sobre todo, más justicia. Muchas gracias.
Je remercie le représentant de l'Espagne pour sa déclaration et je donne maintenant la parole au représentant du Brésil.
Madame la Présidente, je remercie la République démocratique du Congo d'avoir organisé ce débat, ainsi que la représentante spéciale Pramila Patten et la représentante de la société civile. Le Brésil salue le travail essentiel des organisations locales dirigées par des femmes auprès des personnes rescapées. La violence sexuelle liée au conflit constitue une grave violation du droit international et du droit international humanitaire et compromet également la paix et la réconciliation. L'augmentation des cas confirmés par les Nations Unies, malgré une sous-déclaration chronique, exige une réponse urgente. Le rapport du secrétaire général révèle un écart alarmant entre les normes et leur mise en œuvre. Le principal défi n'est donc pas l'absence de normes, mais leur application effective. L'assistance technique apportée par les Nations Unies aux institutions nationales montre qu'il est possible d'obtenir des résultats concrets. La lutte contre l'impunité est indispensable. Les États ont la responsabilité première d'enquêter sur ces crimes, d'en poursuivre les auteurs et de garantir l'accès à la justice et à des réparations effectives. Toutes les allégations doivent faire l'objet d'enquêtes indépendantes et impartiales, sans sélectivité ni deux poids, deux mesures. L'accès des mécanismes compétents des Nations Unies aux zones touchées, y compris aux territoires occupés et aux lieux de détention, doit être garanti. Les accords de paix, les cessez-le-feu et les mécanismes de justice transitionnelle doivent traiter de ces crimes et protéger les droits des personnes rescapées ainsi que ceux des enfants nés de viols liés au conflit. La justice ne saurait toutefois se limiter aux poursuites pénales. Une approche centrée sur les personnes rescapées doit assurer des soins médicaux et psychosociaux, notamment des services de santé, ainsi qu'un soutien socio-économique et des mesures de réintégration. Les personnes rescapées doivent participer à l'élaboration des solutions qui les concernent. La prévention exige également de s'attaquer aux causes profondes de ces violences, notamment les inégalités, les normes discriminatoires et l'exclusion des femmes des processus décisionnels. Leur participation pleine, égale, effective et sûre aux négociations de paix est essentielle à une paix durable. La multiplication des violences sexuelles liées au conflit, à un moment où les dépenses militaires atteignent des niveaux records à l'échelle mondiale, devrait nous conduire à redoubler les efforts en faveur de la prévention des conflits, de la médiation et de la consolidation de la paix, en veillant à ce que les femmes participent pleinement à toutes les étapes de ces processus. Enfin, les transitions et les retraits des opérations de paix ne doivent pas créer un vide en matière de protection, de suivi et d'assistance. Les plans de transition doivent prévoir les ressources nécessaires pour préserver les mécanismes de suivi et les capacités spécialisées. Les contraintes budgétaires ne sauraient justifier l'abandon des personnes rescapées. Madame la Présidente, le Brésil réaffirme son engagement en faveur de la mise en œuvre intégrale de l'agenda Femmes, Paix et Sécurité, du plein respect du droit international humanitaire, de la protection des populations civiles et d'une politique de tolérance zéro à l'égard de la violence sexuelle liée au conflit. Je vous remercie.
Je remercie le représentant du Brésil pour sa déclaration. Je donne maintenant la parole à la représentante de Chypre.
Madam President, at the outset, allow me to congratulate the Democratic Republic of the Congo for the assumption of the presidency of the Security Council for this month and express our sincere appreciation for convening today's important debate. We also welcome the participation of the Prime Minister of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Her Excellency Mrs. Judith Suminwa Tuluka. We thank the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict, Ms. Pramila Patten, for her insightful briefing and reiterate our full support for her mandate. We also thank Mrs. Jocelyn for her remarks. Cyprus aligns with the statement to be delivered by the European Union, but allow me to share the following in my national capacity. The Secretary General's latest report once again reminds us of the alarming scale and brutality of conflict-related sexual violence. These crimes continue to be used as tactics of war, terrorism, torture, and political repression, devastating the lives of individuals and communities while undermining prospects for sustainable peace. Cyprus unequivocally condemns all forms of gender-based violence, online and offline, including conflict-related sexual violence. We recall the rape and other forms of sexual violence may constitute war crimes, crimes against humanity, or acts of genocide under international law. Ensuring accountability for these crimes is therefore not only a legal obligation, but also a prerequisite for prevention and lasting peace. Allow me to highlight 3 key points. First, survivors must remain at the center of all our efforts. Women, girls, men, and boys experience these crimes differently and require tailored, gender and age-responsive, disability-inclusive, and trauma-informed support. They must have safe and timely access to justice, legal assistance, health care, psychosocial services, and effective reparations free from stigma and fear of reprisals. Second, impunity must end. We call on all states to strengthen the national capacities to investigate and prosecute conflict-related sexual violence while ensuring victim-centered justice processes. Existing Security Council sanction regimes should also be fully utilized to reinforce accountability, deter future violations, and send a clear message that perpetrators will be held responsible for their crimes. Furthermore, we underline the indispensable role of women protection advisors and women-led local organizations in prevention, early warning, and survivor assistance. Their work must be adequately resourced and protected, particularly during transitions or drawdowns of United Nations peacekeeping operations. Third, sustainable peace cannot be achieved without the full, equal, meaningful, and safe participation of women. The Women, Peace and Security Agenda remains our strongest framework for advancing women's leadership in conflict prevention, peace building, and recovery. At a time of increasing humanitarian needs and shrinking resources, our collective responsibility is to ensure the effective implementation of all WPS commitments. Madam President, Cyprus remains firmly committed to advancing the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, both nationally and internationally. Earlier this year, we adopted our second National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security, reaffirming our commitment to the implementation of Security Council Resolution 1325 and subsequent WPS resolutions. The new action plan strengthens measures on participation, protection, prevention, and relief and recovery, while placing greater emphasis on gender mainstreaming across national security and foreign policy. Beyond our national efforts, we continue to support women and girls affected by conflict through targeted humanitarian assistance and development cooperation. Through Cyprus Aid, we contribute to humanitarian relief while promoting gender-responsive approaches that address the specific needs of women and girls in crisis situations. As a victim of foreign military invasion and ongoing occupation by Turkey for over 5 decades, Cyprus knows firsthand the devastating and long-lasting consequences of conflict-related sexual violence. During the 1974 Turkish invasion, hundreds of women and girls, as well as men and boys, were subjected to sexual violence by Turkish troops. The suffering of those survivors remains an open wound for Cypriot society and continues to strengthen our unwavering commitment to recognition, justice, accountability, and support for survivors everywhere. An important step towards preserving historical memory and raising awareness at the European and international level is today's adoption of a dedicated resolution by the European Parliament condemning the sexual violence committed by the Turkish troops during the invasion and calling for accountability and support for survivors. Madam President, allow me to conclude by stressing that honoring the promise of international law requires more than declarations. It requires concrete action to protect survivors, hold perpetrators accountable, address the root causes of sexual violence, and ensure that these crimes never become an accepted consequence of conflict. Cyprus stands ready to continue working with the international community to strengthen the global response to conflict-related sexual violence and to fully implement the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. I thank you.
Je remercie la représentante de Chypre pour sa déclaration et je donne maintenant la parole à Monsieur Stavros Lambrinidis, chef de la délégation de l'Union européenne auprès de l'Organisation des Nations Unies.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the European Union and its member states. The candidate countries North Macedonia, Montenegro, Albania, Ukraine, the Republic of Moldova, Bosnia and Herzegovina, as well as Andorra and San Marino align themselves with this statement. We thank the Democratic Republic of the Congo for organizing today's open debate, as well as today's briefers for the sobering remarks. We reiterate our strong support for the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence and Conflict and her team in delivering on their important mandate. We commend their continued commitment to objective and evidence-based reporting in the implementation of this mandate. Colleagues, we should all be deeply alarmed by the escalation in the volume and brutality of conflict-related sexual violence reflected in the report. with the real numbers probably being much higher, as so many have spoken about in this room today, due to the significant underreporting. We are gravely concerned by conflict-related sexual violence committed by state actors, terrorist organizations, and armed groups, wherever and whenever it occurs, be it in Central African Republic, Colombia, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Ethiopia, Haiti, Sudan, or elsewhere. The gaps in services to survivors, the limited capacities of the UN system to address and to report violations, and the persistent impunity reflected in the report are not just disturbing, and of course they are. They underscore the urgent need to strengthen prevention, protection, and accountability. Colleagues, it should go without saying that permanent members of the Security Council bear a special responsibility to maintain international peace and security, and in doing so, to uphold and promote respect for international law. The fact that the report lists, for the first time, Russian armed and security forces for committing conflict-related sexual violence against Ukrainian civilians and prisoners of war in the context of the illegal and unjustified Russian war of aggression against Ukraine must therefore justifiably be especially highlighted. The EU condemns in the strongest possible terms Russia's continued violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law in Ukraine, including the systematic and widespread use of rape and other conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence by Russia as a weapon of war. We reaffirm the EU's commitment to ensuring full accountability for war crimes and the other most serious crimes committed in connection with Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, including investigations by the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, and for the rights of victims to justice, reparation, and guarantees of non-repetition to be upheld. The Secretary General's report continues to list Hamas for sexual violence against civilians and hostages during and in the aftermath of the 7 October terror attacks. It also lists this year, for the first time, the Israeli armed and security forces for cases of sexual violence against Palestinian detainees. We call upon all parties to comply with their obligations under international law, including international human rights law and international humanitarian law. We underline that there must be steps to prevent and address sexual violence. There must be access granted for UN investigations, and there must be accountability and access to justice for all victims. Madam President, all parties assessed in this report must heed the call of the Secretary General to cease acts of sexual violence, take measures to address and prevent its occurrence, allow unfettered access to relevant UN bodies for monitoring purposes, and cooperate with relevant entities. For example, the report highlights the engagement of the DRC with the Special Representative and the subsequent downward trend of cases attributed to the Congolese National Police. Colleagues, without strong accountability, the negative trend of sexual violence in conflict reflected in the report can only get worse. Efforts must continue, therefore, to end impunity and ensure accountability for all violations and abuses of international law, including international human rights and international humanitarian law, wherever they take place, to prevent recurrence and to break cycles of violence. The European Union and its member states apply this principle consistently, including by holding our own armed forces, missions, and operations accountable through a code of conduct. The same standard should apply to all actors. Allegations of conflict-related sexual violence must be investigated thoroughly, independently, and without delay wherever they occur. Madam President, the EU remains strongly committed to the prevention and elimination of conflict-related sexual violence, as well as to guaranteeing a gender-responsive, survivor-centered, and trauma-informed approach in all efforts. In this spirit, and in conclusion, the EU supports UN action against sexual violence in conflict, the Global Survivor Fund, as well as gender-based violence prevention and response in Ukraine, Mali, Cameroon, Sudan, and elsewhere. We believe the focus must remain firmly forward-looking in addressing conflict-related sexual violence. We will continue to do our part and call on the international community to do the same. Thank you.
Je remercie Monsieur Lambrinidis pour sa déclaration et je donne maintenant la parole au représentant de la Tchéquie.
Merci, Madame Présidente. The Czech Republic would like to thank the Democratic Republic of the Congo for convening this important debate, and we are grateful to the briefers for their presentations. Conflict-related sexual violence remains one of the gravest violations of international humanitarian and human rights law. The Secretary General's latest report once again confirms a deeply troubling trend that has persisted for years. Verified cases of sexual violence continue to rise, and impunity endures. Today's debate rightly focuses on honoring the promise of international law to survivors. That promise must be reflected not only in our words, but also in our concrete actions. First, survivors must be at the heart of our response, not merely as beneficiaries of assistance, but as partners and agents of change. We must ensure access to the full range of services: healthcare, including sexual and reproductive health services, psychological support, legal assistance, and long-term support for integration. The Czech Republic continues to support projects addressing gender-based violence in conflict and post-conflict settings, and to assist survivors, among them Ukrainian refugees, through integrated support services. Support for local and women-led organizations should remain a priority, as they are often the first responders and the most trusted providers of assistance. Mr. President, second, accountability is indispensable. Conflict-related sexual violence must never be allowed to become a crime committed with impunity. Respect for international humanitarian and criminal law, together with survivor-centered approaches to justice, is essential to deter future violations and to support survivors. We encourage the Security Council to make full use of the tools at its disposal, including by integrating gender considerations into mission mandates and by applying targeted sanctions. We also wish to reiterate the importance of monitoring, reporting, and accountability mechanisms, including the work of the Special Representative of the Secretary General and Women Protection Advisors. Third, as United Nations peace operations transition or draw down, we must avoid protection gaps that increase the risk of sexual violence and undermine support for survivors. Sustainable and properly resourced national capacities, continued integration engagement, and support for local service providers are all essential if prevention, monitoring, and assistance are to be maintained. Finally, we reaffirm that the full, equal, and meaningful participation of women in peace and security processes is essential to preventing and addressing conflict-related sexual violence. Civil society, too, has a vital role to play in prevention, in service delivery, and in ensuring accountability. The Czech Republic remains committed to the full implementation of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda and to ensuring that survivors of conflict-related sexual violence receive the protection, justice, and support they all deserve. I thank you.
Je remercie le représentant de la République tchèque. Je donne maintenant la parole à la représentante de El Salvador.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. El Salvador agradece la convocatoria a este debate abierto y se alinea la intervención a ser pronunciada por la distinguida delegación de Canadá en nombre del Grupo de Amigos sobre Mujeres, Paz y Seguridad. Mi país condena de manera más enérgica la violencia sexual relacionada con los conflictos, ya sea utilizada como táctica de guerra, instrumento de tortura, método de represión política, herramienta de terrorismo o mecanismo de control sobre comunidades y territorios. Las resoluciones de este Consejo han reconocido que la violencia sexual relacionada con los conflictos no surge de manera aislada. Se inscribe en un patrón más amplio de violencias interrelacionadas y recurrentes contra de las mujeres y las niñas, que puede profundizarse antes, durante y después de los conflictos, especialmente cuando persisten la exclusión, la impunidad y la ausencia de servicios esenciales para su protección. Por ello, al abordar esta problemática, el Consejo debe mirar más allá de sus manifestaciones inmediatas y considerar también los factores que la posibilitan y perpetúan. Esto exige reconocer el vínculo directo entre la protección y participación. La violencia sexual limita la participación plena, igualitaria y significativa de las mujeres en la vida pública, los procesos de paz y la reconstrucción, y a su vez la exclusión de las mujeres en estos espacios debilita las respuestas de prevención, protección y rendición de cuentas. Señor presidente, el más reciente informe del secretario general confirma una realidad alarmante. Los casos verificados aumentaron considerablemente en el 2025, en un contexto de conflictos prolongados, restricciones al acceso humanitario, ataques contra actores de primera línea y reducción de servicios vitales. Sabemos, además, que estas cifras no reflejan la verdadera magnitud del problema, por el temor de las víctimas a revelar lo ocurrido ante la falta de garantías. Ante esta realidad, El Salvador desea destacar 5 prioridades. Primero, las operaciones de paz y demás presencias de las Naciones Unidas deben contar con capacidades suficientes para prevenir, monitorear y responder a esta violencia. Ello incluye el despliegue oportuno de asesoras de protección de mujeres, incluso durante transiciones, retiros o reconfiguraciones de misiones. Resulta preocupante que estas especialistas estén desplegadas únicamente en 9 de los más de 20 entornos abordados en el informe del secretario general. Segundo, debe prevenirse y sancionarse las amenazas y ataques contra el personal humanitario de las Naciones Unidas y las organizaciones de mujeres y prestadoras de servicio. También debemos prestar mayor atención a las amenazas digitales, el discurso de odio misógino y las formas de intimidación en línea que buscan silenciar a las mujeres y limitar su participación. Tercero, la violencia sexual relacionada con los conflictos debe incorporarse de manera sistemática como criterio autónomo en todos los regímenes de sanciones pertinentes. La reincidencia de perpetradores incluidos durante años en los informes del secretario general no puede seguir sin consecuencias. Cuarto, la rendición de cuentas debe estar al centro de nuestra respuesta. Las investigaciones y los procesos judiciales deben de ser independientes, imparciales y centrados en las víctimas, sin importar el rango o afiliación de los perpetradores. Asimismo, las personas sobrevivientes deben tener acceso real a la justicia, atención médica, apoyo psicosocial, reparación efectiva y garantías de no repetición. La justicia no puede ser un privilegio inaccesible para quienes ya han sufrido lo inimaginable. Quinto, es necesario fortalecer los marcos de control de armas. Deben detenerse las transferencias de armas cuando exista un alto riesgo de que sean utilizadas para cometer violaciones graves del derecho internacional humanitario o actos de violencia contra las mujeres y las niñas. La amplia disponibilidad y proliferación de armas pequeñas y ligeras ha facilitado, incluso en nuestra región, que grupos delictivos realicen actividades de trata y explotación sexual. Finalmente, en el contexto de la iniciativa de ONU 80 y de las medidas de consolidación y austeridad derivadas de las restricciones financieras, El Salvador subraya que toda reforma debe preservar la capacidad de las Naciones Unidas para prevenir la violencia y proteger a quienes más lo necesitan. Para una persona en situación de riesgo o sobreviviente, una reducción de recursos puede significar no contar con presencia preventiva en el terreno, no contar con atención médica a tiempo, no recibir apoyo psicosocial, no tener protección frente a represalias o no contar una puerta segura a la cual acudir después de haber sufrido violencia. La eficiencia institucional debe fortalecer, no debilitar nuestra capacidad colectiva de prevenir, proteger y acompañar a las víctimas en su camino hacia la recuperación, la justicia y la dignidad. Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Je remercie la représentante d'El Salvador et je donne maintenant la parole au représentant de la Slovénie.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me congratulate you on assuming the presidency and also thank you for organizing today's open debate. I also thank Special Representative of the Secretary General, Ms. Patten, for her report and for briefing today, and most of all, for her dedication and commitment to the survivors of the conflict-related violence. We also thank Ms. Jocelyn for her contribution to this important debate. Slovenia aligns itself with the statements delivered by the European Union and the Group of Friends of Women, Peace and Security. Mr. President, we are deeply concerned by the findings of this latest report. Sexual violence continues to rise, including as a tactic of war, torture and terrorism. We know the UN recorded cases doubled in 2025 compared to the year before. Mr. President, let me use this opportunity to highlight the following points of particular importance for the work of this esteemed Council. First, insist on accountability. Accountability for conflict-related sexual violence. Perpetrators must be held accountable through strong national rule of law institutions or through international courts, such as the International Criminal Court. Effective prosecution of international crimes requires robust mechanisms for mutual legal assistance, evidence sharing, cross-border coordination, extradition, and protection of witnesses and victims, such as provided by the Ljubljana-The Hague Convention. Second, use UN sanctions regimes to ensure compliance with international law and relevant Security Council resolutions. The Council designations should consistently be applied against all persistent perpetrators of conflict-related sexual violence. Third, deploy and maintain women's protection advisors in all situations of concern. Their timely and reliable information and analysis of conflict-related sexual violence, their engagement with parties to conflict, and formulation of victim and survivor-centered responses to these crimes are invaluable. We recall the need to ensure comprehensive medical care and services, psychosocial support and legal assistance to victims and survivors. We reaffirm the need to support the work of women's organizations, local civil society, healthcare providers, and human rights defenders in this context. Slovenia reiterates our strong support for the mandate and work of the SRSG on sexual violence in conflict and her office, as well as the team of experts on the rule of law and the UN action against sexual violence in conflict. Slovenia continues to support the mandates through 2026 contribution to the conflict-related sexual violence prevention multi-partner trust fund. I thank you.
Je remercie le représentant de la Slovénie. Je donne maintenant la parole au représentant de l'Italie.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank the Democratic Republic of Congo for convening this timely and important open debate. Italy reaffirms its steadfast support for the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict and her team as they carry out their mandate. The annual report remains a vital contribution by the United Nations to the documentation of and response to conflict-related sexual violence. Italy aligns itself with the statements of the European Union and of the Group of Friends of Women, Peace and Security. 26 years after the adoption of Resolution 1325 and more than 15 years since the establishment of the mandate of the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict, we are gathered here to honor a promise that remains for too many survivors unfulfilled. The trend documented in the Secretary General's report is alarming. Verified cases of conflict-related sexual violence have risen sharply, marked by extreme brutality and overwhelmingly targeting women and girls. Furthermore, we know these figures capture only a fraction of the reality, given the chronic underreporting driven by stigma, fear of reprisal, and the absence of or inadequacy of all available services. Behind every number is a survivor whose access to healthcare, justice, and reparation is too often obstructed by the very crisis, escalating and proliferating armed conflicts, deepening humanitarian emergencies, compounding climate and food-related crises that made them a victim in the first place. Mr. President, honoring the promise of international law and the Security Council's normative framework developed throughout the years means closing the persistent gap between norms and their implementation. First, on accountability, impunity must never be the default. Italy supports the integration of sexual violence expertise within section monitoring groups and continues to sustain the work of national justice systems in ensuring survivor-centered investigations and transformative reparations. Second, on protection. The drawdown of United Nations peace operations must never translate into a protection vacuum. We advocate for deliberate transition planning that safeguards monitoring, reporting, and assistance capacities, including through the continued deployment of women's protection advisors in all relevant situations of concern. Third, on survivors themselves. They must be recognized not only as victims, but as authors proposing concrete and effective solutions that concern them. This means investing in comprehensive services, medical, psychological, legal, and socioeconomic, and ensuring that children born of conflict-related rape and sexual violence are protected from the layered stigma, discrimination, and exclusion that they too often experience. This also entails involving survivors directly in policy formulation and decision-making processes, ensuring that the survivor-centered approach becomes a tangible reality rather than a mere aspiration. Mr. President, at a time of considerable financial strain across the UN system, Italy wishes to underscore the importance of preserving CRSV prevention and response as part of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. We encourage member states to continue prioritizing support for survivor-centered programming as well for women-led civil society organizations, whose proximity to affected communities makes them invaluable partners. Let us honor the promises that made to survivors by ensuring that justice is not merely pledged but delivered today. Thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie le représentant de l'Italie. Je donne à présent la parole au représentant de l'Afrique du Sud.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Allow me to take this opportunity to salute the sister republic of the Democratic Republic of Congo for assuming the presidency of the UN Security Council for the month of July, and at the same time to welcome the convening of this annual debate, the first during the presidency of the DRC, signaling the importance the DRC attaches to conflict-related sexual violence. And allow me at the same time to also thank the briefers for their insightful presentations. Mr. President, conflict-related sexual violence remains one of the gravest violations of international law, which occurs with regularity with an increasing number of verified cases, bearing in mind the significance of underreporting of such cases. This is because victims and survivors continue to face insecurity, stigma, and deep physical and psychological scars long after conflicts end. South Africa is deeply concerned about the sharp increase in verified cases as indicated in the UN Secretary General's annual report. Therefore, honoring the promise of international law requires sustained prevention, accountability, victim and survivor-centered support during UN peace operations and after their drawdown. Mr. President, the UN peace support operations provide an important lifeline and protection mechanism to prevent cases of sexual violence, yet they lack the full capacity to deal with this core mandate requirement. South Africa calls for continued support for the deployment of women's protection advisors, as well as gender advisors to address the full spectrum of CRSV-related cases, including rape, gang rape, abductions, and sexual slavery, as well as other heinous crimes. These violations of international law tend to have a lasting psychosocial impact long after their perpetration. We are therefore also concerned about the security, assistance, and monitoring gaps created during transitions from peace missions that heighten risks of sexual violence and weaken national protection systems. CRSV mandates must therefore be sustainably transferred to national and regional actors, including continuity in monitoring and reporting, early warning capacities, and support for national investigations. Mr. President, South Africa emphasizes the imperative for protection of frontline service providers, health workers, justice actors, women-led organizations, and women human rights defenders who face heightened risks of attacks and reprisals. Peace operations, sanctions regimes, and national protection strategies must explicitly address these threats through protective accompaniment, rapid response mechanisms, and confidential reporting channels. Member states, UN entities, and international organizations should adopt concrete measures to ensure timely protection assistance, reparations, and long-term reintegration support for survivors and children born of rape. These include predictable financing for survivor and survivor-centered services, accessible reparation programs, strengthened national justice systems, and sustained livelihood. Mr. President, the Security Council and international community must enhance political commitment and financing of CRSV mandate, including through strengthened partnerships with women-led and local organizations. These actors are indispensable to prevention, monitoring, and victim and survivor support and must receive direct, flexible, and long-term funding. With the focus of this debate on honoring the promise of international law, it is imperative that the Security Council should enhance its mechanisms for preventing impunity and holding those who commit the myriad of CRSV acts accountable, including the unconscionable and ever-increasing use of CRSV as a deliberate weapon of war. The full implementation of Security Council Resolution 2467 is essential in this respect, as it calls for accountability and justice, including investigating, prosecuting, and punishing perpetrators. Resolution 2476 significantly moved beyond viewing survivors as only victims, but places greater emphasis on their agency, protection, participation, and long-term recovery. However, we regret the lack of attention in the resolution on sexual and reproductive health services and urge the Council not to regress in its women, peace, and security obligation, including the focus on the gender dimension. In conclusion, as we mark almost 26 years since Resolution 1325 was adopted, South Africa calls for protection, justice, and reparations for survivors. We stand ready to work with all partners to ensure that international law protects, empowers, and restores the dignity of those who have endured grave violations. I thank you.
Je remercie le représentant de l'Afrique du Sud. Je donne à présent la parole au représentant du Japon.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank the Democratic Republic of the Congo for convening this important open debate. I also thank SRSG Patten for your sobering briefing. Survivors' access to justice for conflict-related sexual violence is severely limited when judicial systems are not fully established, particularly in situations where public infrastructure itself is fragile due to conflict or political instability. Such conditions make it exceedingly difficult to implement a survivor-centered approach mandated by Security Council Resolution 2467. To break the cycle of impunity, respect for the rule of law and accountability for perpetrators are indispensable. Japan strongly prioritizes capacity building for legal professionals and strengthening of justice-related organizations, which requires coordinated efforts by member states and the UN system. Mr. President, human rights monitors and humanitarian personnel continue to bravely work on the front lines, including in conflict zones, to realize a survivor-centered approach. Ensuring their physical and psychological safety is also essential for the prevention and elimination of and response to CRSV. Japan calls upon all parties to allow and facilitate full, rapid, safe, unimpeded, and sustained humanitarian access, and to ensure the protection of humanitarian personnel in accordance with the relevant international humanitarian law. Japan also recognizes the critical role played by women's protection advisors deployed under UN peace operation mandates in the prevention of and response to CRSV. Japan underscores the need to full, equal, meaningful, and safe participation of women in peace building, aiming at the inclusion of CRSV survivors. Japan has launched a project in Democratic Republic of the Congo to strengthen survivors' access to justice for CRSV in collaboration with the Office of SRSG Patten. Through this project, Japan is working to enhance accountability mechanisms by promoting the registration of CRSV cases with judicial authorities in conflict-affected areas, and by providing technical and logistical support for investigations and prosecutions of cross-border cases. The survivor-centered approach goes beyond survivors' access to justice. Japan has implemented comprehensive CRSV response tailored to survivors' needs in Mali, Sudan, and Central African Republic, addressing medical and psychological support, as well as social and economic reintegration. Ensuring survivors' access to justice during and after conflict contributes to restoring and affirming their dignity. This is encapsulated in the human security approach that Japan has long advocated, preserving human dignity through protection and empowerment. Mr. President, Japan remains committed to the WPS agenda and to combating impunity, standing with survivors of CRSV and communities affected by violent conflict, and reaffirms its strong support for the leadership of SRSG Patten and her office. I thank you.
Je remercie le représentant du Japon. Je donne à présent la parole au représentant de l'Angola.
Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, at the outset, Angola congratulates the Democratic Republic of Congo on convening this timely open debate and thanks the Secretary General for his comprehensive report. We will also express our appreciation to the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence and Conflict and the other briefers for their valuable insights. The Secretary General report presents a deeply alarming picture. The significant increase of conflict-related sexual violence in 2025 confirms that these crimes continue to be used as tactics of war, terrorism, torture, and political repression inflicting devastating consequences on individuals, families, and communities while undermining peace and security. Women and girls remain the primary victims, while men and boys are also affected, often remaining invisible due to the stigma, fear, and limited access to support services. Conflict-related sexual violence constitutes a serious violation of international humanitarian law, international human rights law, and where applicable, international criminal law. Honoring the promise of international law requires translating legal obligations into concrete actions. Mr. President, protecting civilians requires moving from reactive response to preventive strategies. In this regard, we wish to highlight 4 priorities. First, survivors must remain at the center of all prevention and response efforts. They should have timely, safe, and non-discriminatory access to comprehensive medical care, psychosocial support, legal assistance, and where appropriate, sexual and reproductive health care, while fully respecting their dignity, rights, and choices. Second, accountability is essential. All parties to the armed conflict must comply with international law and the relevant Security Council resolutions. National justice systems should be strengthened to investigate and prosecute these crimes effectively, ensuring that the perpetrators are held accountable and impunity is not tolerated. Third, the international community should ensure predictable and sustainable financing for programs supporting survivors. Angola is deeply concerned that the current funding reductions are weakening essential protection and assistance services in conflict-affected settings. Fourth, preventing conflict-related sexual violence must remain an integral component of conflict prevention, mediation, peacekeeping, peace building, and security sector reform. Lasting peace cannot be achieved while these crimes remain unaddressed. Mr. President, Angola reaffirms the importance of the full implementation of Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security, and subsequent relevant resolutions. Ensuring the full, equal, meaningful, and safe participation of women in peace processes, decision-making, and post-conflict recovery is not only a matter of right, but also a prerequisite for sustainable peace and effective conflict prevention. In conclusion, Angola calls upon all parties to the armed conflict to fully respect international humanitarian law, the international human rights law, protect civilians, particularly women and children, and immediately end the use of sexual violence as a tactic of war, terrorism, torture, and political repression. By strengthening accountability, supporting survivors, reinforcing national institutions, and deepening international cooperation, we can honor the promise of international law and advance our shared responsibility to prevent conflict-related sexual violence and build lasting peace. I thank you.
Je remercie le représentant de l'Angola. Je donne à présent la parole au représentant de Timor-Leste.
Mr. President, Timor-Leste welcomes this important debate on conflict-related sexual violence under the theme Honoring the Promise of International Law to Survivors of Conflict-Related Sexual Violence. We thank the Prime Minister of the Democratic Republic of Congo for her leadership, and we express our appreciation to the Special Representative of the Secretary General, Madame Pramila Patten, for her tireless commitment to advancing survivor-centered justice. Mr. President, around the world in conflict zones documented by the United Nations, regional organizations, and civil society networks, conflict-related sexual violence continues to be used systematically as a tactic of war, repression, and terror. Women, men, girls, and boys have endured rape, sexual slavery, forced marriage, forced pregnancy, and sexual torture. These violations are widespread, deliberate, and devastating. These violations constitute some of the gravest crimes recognized under international law and continue to leave profound and lasting consequences for survivors and their communities. However, In many contexts, the decades after the violence occurred, cases remain unresolved and survivors continue to live with the physical, psychological, and socioeconomic consequences of these crimes. International law provides a clear and powerful framework for justice. However, as this Council has repeatedly recognized, the promise of international law is only meaningful when it is implemented. Across many conflict-affected settings, implementation gaps persist. Despite the work of truth commissions and investigative bodies, many survivors continue to face stigma, limited access to effective remedies, and legal, institutional, and political barriers to comprehensive support. Honoring the promise of international law requires opening new horizons and developing innovative venues for action within the international system. In this context, Timor-Leste offers 4 practical avenues for consideration. First, fostering regional platforms to facilitate the exchange of good practices, technical expertise, and survivor-centered approaches to recognition, reparations, rehabilitations, and long-term support. Second, advancing international cooperation for the effective implementation of survivors' rights to reparations, rehabilitation, and comprehensive support, recognizing that the consequences of conflict-related sexual violence often endure long after conflict have ended. Third, making better use of existing United Nations mechanisms to provide technical assistance to member states and support the integration of survivor-centered approaches into national policies and programs. Finally, integrating conflict-related sexual violence into global development frameworks by incorporating indicators on trauma recovery, access to remedies, survivor economic empowerment, and community resilience into beyond GDP and human development metrics. These will recognize that the consequences of CRSV extend far beyond individual harm, with lasting impacts on social cohesion, human capital, and national development trajectories. Mr. President, the global history of conflict-related sexual violence is one of profound suffering, but also of resilience, truth-seeking, and moral clarity. Survivors across conflict zones reminds us that international law provides a promise, but not a guarantee. Honoring that promise requires sustained commitment, innovative international engagement, and survivor-centered approaches that transcends traditional justice mechanisms, while ensuring that avenues for justice and legal accountability remain available where possible and consistent with international law. The enduring consequences of conflict-related sexual violence are not merely the legacy of past conflicts. They are a continuing test of whether international law can restore dignity, hope, and opportunity to those who have suffered most. Timor-Leste stands ready to work with this Council, with member states, and with survivors everywhere to ensure that the promise of international law is finally fulfilled. Thank you.
Je remercie le représentant de Timor-Leste. Je donne à présent la parole au représentant de l'Australie.
Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président, and thank you very much indeed, Special Representative. I speak for Canada, New Zealand, and of course my own country, Australia, and we particularly thank the Democratic Republic of the Congo for convening this debate. The Secretary-General's report is stark. UN-verified cases of conflict-related sexual violence were marked by extreme brutality and rose sharply in 2025, overwhelmingly targeting women and girls. These verified cases represent only a fraction of the true scale because stigma, fear of reprisals, and lack of support services continue to prevent survivors from coming forward. Too many survivors and children born of conflict-related rape remain invisible. Too many are denied justice, dignity, care, and legal identity with profound intergenerational consequences. CANS makes 3 points. The first, we must end impunity for conflict-related sexual violence. We must use accountability mechanisms effectively, including through sanctions regimes, domestic systems, and other avenues available under the international legal framework. Second, we must prevent conflict-related sexual violence by addressing the conditions that enable it. This requires gender-responsive security sectors, including the deployment of women's protection advisors in peacekeeping and special political missions. Third, CANS is committed to practical action. we must ensure survivors' access to sustained trauma-informed support, including mental and medical health services, sexual and reproductive health services, legal aid, livelihood support, and transformative reparations. Protecting survivors also means protecting those who support them. As signatories to the Declaration for the Protection of Humanitarian Personnel, CANS is taking practical action to strengthen protection of humanitarian workers, helping survivors access the support, protection, and justice to which they are entitled under international law. CANS is backing that commitment with practical action at national, regional, and global levels. Australia partners with the Global Survivors Fund to provide interim reparations for survivors of CRSV and supports the International Gender Justice Practitioner Hub to enhance trauma-informed and survivor-centred accountability processes. Like Australia, Canada supports the Global Survivors Fund and strengthens accountability for CRSV by supporting United Nations Women's deployment of sexual and gender-based violence experts to international accountability mechanisms. New Zealand helps prevent violence against women by supporting initiatives across the Pacific region that strengthen women's leadership in peace and security, improve protection from gender-based violence, and integrate women and girls' perspectives into security and peace-building efforts. President, CANS urges all member states to act with urgency and resolve to tackle the drivers of conflict-related sexual violence, end impunity for perpetrators, and provide survivors with the support and the justice that they need. Thank you.
Je remercie le représentant de l'Australie pour sa déclaration. Je donne à présent la parole au représentant du Cambodge.
Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, Cambodia commends the Democratic Republic of Congo for convening these timely open debates and thanks all the briefers for their important insights. Conflict-related sexual violence brings devastating consequences for all human beings, especially women and girls, families, and communities. Such a crime not only violated human rights dignities itself, but also for fundamental principles of international law, including international humanitarian law, international human rights law, and the Charter of the United Nations. Therefore, Cambodia wishes to stress the following points. First, all parties to conflicts, be state or non-state actors, must fully comply with international law and relevant Security Council resolutions, rule of engagement, and particularly the knowledge of international humanitarian law should be widely integrated to all relevant players, both in time of war and of peace. Second, accountability must be ensured. Perpetrators to the conflict-related sexual violence must not be left untouched. They must be investigated and prosecuted through fair, credible, and survivor-sensitive judicial processes. Such accountability is essential to break the cycle of impunity, deter future violations, and affirm the dignity and right of those who died and survived. Third, a survivor-centric approach must be at the center of all responses. Medical, psychological, social, and legal support, reparation of long-term reintegrations, and transnational justice must be timely, accessible, without discrimination, and taken into consideration of the durable peace. In conclusion, Cambodia reaffirms its steadfast commitment to the women's peace and security agendas to build a world where sexual violence is never tolerated and human dignity is protected, whether in time of war or in time of peace. Thank you.
Je remercie le représentant du Cambodge. Je donne à présent la parole à la représentante de l'Estonie.
President, Estonia aligns itself with the statement of the European Union and the statement of the Group of Friends of Women, Peace and Security. We thank the Democratic Republic of the Congo for convening this open debate and all the briefers for their valuable insights. Conflict-related sexual violence is not an inevitable byproduct of war. It is a deliberate crime used as a tactic of war, terror, torture, and repression. Its consequences do not end when the wars and conflicts end. They last for years, often haunting the survivors for a lifetime. The Secretary General's report makes clear that this is a global crisis. Documented cases rose sharply in 2025 and were marked by extreme brutality. In the DRC, Sudan, Myanmar, Haiti, and elsewhere, conflict-related sexual violence continues to devastate individuals and communities. We are particularly concerned by the high volume of incidents attributed to state actors. For the first time, armed and security forces of a permanent member of this Council are listed in the annex of the Secretary General's report for committing conflict-related sexual violence against Ukrainian civilians and prisoners of war. As a permanent member of the Security Council, Russia bears a particular responsibility to uphold international peace and security. Yet, it continues to attack the very foundations of the UN Charter. We underline that Hamas continues to be listed among parties credibly suspected of being responsible for conflict-related sexual violence. The Secretary General has also included Israeli armed and security forces in the list in relation to incidents attributed to them. Estonia unequivocally condemns all acts of conflict-related sexual violence, regardless of the perpetrator. There is no justification for the use of sexual violence under any circumstances. President, accountability is essential to ending conflict-related sexual violence. Impunity allows these crimes to continue and must be brought to an end. International humanitarian law, human rights law, and international criminal law must be upheld. All allegations must be investigated promptly, independently, and impartially, and perpetrators must be held accountable, regardless of rank or affiliation. Estonia supports all efforts to document, investigate, and prosecute these crimes, including through cooperation with the International Criminal Court and other international accountability mechanisms. In this regard, we welcome the launch of the global CRSV prosecution network and community of practice and have the honor to announce that Estonia has joined the network. Estonia reaffirms its unwavering support to the mandate of the Special Representative of the Secretary General, Pramila Patten, and the team of experts on the rule of law and sexual violence in conflict. We condemn all attacks against the Special Representatives of the Secretary General and the UN architecture that is intended to protect all people from atrocity crimes. I thank you.
Je remercie la représentante de l'Estonie. Je donne à présent la parole à la représentante de la Finlande.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the Nordic countries, Denmark, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and my own country, Finland. We thank the Democratic Republic of Congo for convening this debate. We commend the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict, Ms. Pramila Patten, for your leadership and your impressive and sustained efforts to prevent and address conflict-related sexual violence. We should all be extremely alarmed that the UN-verified cases of conflict-related sexual violence continue to rise sharply, often marked by extreme brutality. Persistent underreporting means that these numbers are likely to represent only the tip of the iceberg. President, sexual violence in conflict endangers lives, inflicts profound trauma on individuals, and shatters communities with consequences that can endure for generations. It constitutes a grave violation of international human rights and humanitarian law. Using sexual violence in warfare is a war crime, and may also constitute a crime against humanity or an act of genocide. Rape must never be considered as some kind of inevitable consequence of war. The Nordic countries are deeply concerned by the growing number of national armed and security forces listed in the Secretary General's report. We call on all parties to conflicts to cease all forms of sexual violence and fully comply with the obligations under international law and relevant Security Council resolutions. This is a question of leadership. The entire chain of command in any conflict must know and respect the rules and make sure others do as well. Prevention remains our primary objective. This requires addressing root causes, gender inequality, discrimination, and the exclusion of women from political and peace processes. For survivors, we emphasize access to justice and comprehensive support, including sexual and reproductive health care. Accountability is necessary for justice, which must underpin prevention and find ways to reconciliation. It requires credible investigations, national prosecution, and cooperation with international courts, especially the ICC. We welcome initiatives such as the Global Network of Prosecutors and Practitioners, which help close accountability gaps and demonstrate the international community's resolve to address CRSV. Nordic countries also support the call to action on protection from gender-based violence in emergencies, the global political initiative to strengthen system-wide accountability, transform the way gender-based violence is addressed, and empower national and local women-led organizations and other CSOs, often the first and last responders. President, the Nordic countries reaffirm strong support to the Women, Peace and Security agenda and for UN mechanisms implementing Security Council Resolution 1888, including the work of the Special Representative Patten and the team of experts. Gender advisors and women's protection advisors in UN operations play an indispensable role. Without them, Security Council commitments risk remaining words on paper. The Council should send an unequivocal message. Sexual violence is a serious crime, not a tactic, and those responsible will always be held fully accountable. I thank you.
Je remercie la représentante de la Finlande et je donne à présent la parole au représentant de la Croatie.
Thank you, Mr. President. Croatia aligns itself with the statement of the European Union and of the Group of Friends of Women, Peace and Security, and I would like to add a few remarks in my national capacity. I thank the Democratic Republic of the Congo, all the briefers for their valuable insights, and Special Representative Patten for this important report, highlighting human suffering and serious violations of human dignity caused by conflict-related sexual violence. Despite strong normative frameworks recognizing it as a threat to international peace and security, conflict-related sexual violence continues to increase every year. It is becoming more brutal, with a disproportionate impact on the most vulnerable. And it is affecting all, women, men, girls, and boys, especially those in displacement and detention settings. We're witnessing new alarming trends, including growing attacks on humanitarian workers, threats to human rights defenders, and even survivors, who are increasingly experiencing harassment and intimidation in the digital space. While today's security environment is becoming more complex, our responsibilities remain clear. First, we must firmly support the SRSG's call to end all forms of conflict-related sexual violence. We encourage states to align their laws with international humanitarian and human rights law, and to monitor compliance with relevant Council resolutions. Next, in fragile and conflict-affected settings, protecting civilians and ensuring safe access to medical and psychological care for survivors are essential. This must be complemented by robust accountability, comprehensive reparations, and sustainable integration programs. As an example, survivors of sexual violence perpetrated during the Croatian homeland war are entitled to financial reparations and special care even if the perpetrators are never found or brought to justice. We stand ready to share our practices and experiences. Justice for survivors must remain a priority. Firm in our conviction that impunity must never be the norm, Croatia is proud to announce that we are joining the CRSV prosecution network, contributing to stronger accountability mechanisms for these crimes. And finally, the report highlights the serious consequences of funding cuts, which weaken prevention efforts and erode trust in institutions. We call on all member states to sustain financial support, especially for civil society and women's organizations at local level. And let me conclude, Mr. President, by emphasizing that prevention begins in times of peace, by eliminating gender inequalities and harmful social norms. These efforts are crucial and more likely to endure when supported by the full and meaningful participation of women in political and peace-building processes. I thank you.
Je remercie le représentant de la Croatie. Je donne à présent la parole à la représentante du Royaume des Pays-Bas.
Mr. President, the Kingdom of the Netherlands aligns itself with the statements of the European Union and Group of Friends on Women, Peace and Security. Conflict-related sexual violence is a totally unacceptable weapon of war and catastrophic for survivors, communities, and future generations. We are deeply alarmed that conflict-related sexual violence continues to be perpetrated with impunity. I will make 3 points: 1 on accountability, 2 on essential health services, and 3 funding for survivor and women-led organizations, including civil society and survivor networks. First, accountability. If perpetrators face no consequences, conflict-related sexual violence will not stop. Accountability efforts must be survivor-centered. Impunity not only denies justice, it re-traumatizes survivors. The Kingdom of the Netherlands therefore stresses the need to address sexual and gender-based violence in all accountability mechanisms and criminal proceedings. We support the mandate of the Special Representative on Sexual Violence in Conflict and the team of experts in advancing accountability. At the same time, justice must go beyond criminal trials. Survivor-centered justice should include reparations, recognition of harm, and access to mental health and psychosocial support. In Sudan, credible reports of systematic and widespread conflict-related sexual violence in and around Al-Fashir are alarming. Now hundreds of thousands of civilians are at risk in Al Obeid. These violations must be put to an end. Also, the ongoing violations by Russia in Ukraine, including in the temporary occupied territories, must cease immediately, as documented in the Secretary General's report. In this light, we reject the claims and characterizations made by the Russian Federation in today's debate. Mr. President, my second point is on essential health services. Survivors need immediate and comprehensive care. Access to sexual and reproductive health services, including safe abortion, is vital and life-saving. These services must be prioritized in every humanitarian crisis. The Kingdom of the Netherlands remains a steadfast donor to organizations such as IPAS and the International Planned Parenthood Federation, which provides these services in conflict settings. Mr. President, my third and last point is on funding for survivor and women-led organizations. Women and survivors are often the first responders, running shelters, providing psychosocial support, and holding communities together. Yet their organizations remain structurally underfunded. This week, the Netherlands launched the FEM Focus Grant instrument to fund women's rights organizations in West Africa, the Horn of Africa, and the MENA region. We urge member states to provide multi-year, flexible and direct financing to these organizations and survivor networks. my country, the Kingdom of the Netherlands, remains, Mr. President, firmly committed to combating conflict-related sexual violence and to ensuring that survivors are at the center of our collective response. I thank you.
Je remercie la représentante des Pays-Bas. Je passe la parole à présent au représentant du Népal.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me begin by thanking the Presidency of Democratic Republic of Congo for convening today's open debate on this very important issue. I also thank the Special Representative of Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict and other distinguished briefers for their valuable insights. Mr. President, conflict-related sexual violence has continued to grow in recent years. The Secretary General's report shows a sobering reality. The cases of conflict-related sexual violence have increased in scale and in brutality, while protracted conflicts, shrinking humanitarian access, persistent impunity, under-reporting, and funding shortfalls continue to deny survivors justice, protections, and recovery. We strongly denounce the use of sexual violence as a tactic of war, terrorism, and political repressions. We reaffirm our steadfast support for the Security Council's landmark resolutions 1325 and 1820 and the broader women, peace, and security architectures aimed at ending the sexual violence in the conflict. Mr. President, let me highlight a few priorities for our collective actions. First, we must end impunity and hold the perpetrator into account. This requires stronger political commitment, good faith implementation of the international legal obligations, and inclusive partnerships. We underscore adhering to the international humanitarian law, international human rights law, and relevant Security Council resolutions, whilst effectively enforcing existing sanctions regimes against the perpetrators. Second, prevention should remain a priority. A whole-of-society approach with full, equal, and meaningful participation of women in conflict prevention, in peace process, in peace building, and in security sector governance is indispensable to ensuring sustainable peace, justice, and development. We should address root causes of the conflict, strengthen gender-responsive early warning systems and early response mechanisms, and ensure specialized pre-deployment and in-mission training for peacekeepers on conflict-related sexual violence. Third, potential risk of conflict-related sexual violence during transition and drawdown must be addressed as an integral component of peace operations and political processes. Peace agreements, ceasefires, and political settlements should explicitly prohibit conflict-related sexual violence, exclude such crimes from amnesties, and integrate protection measures for survivors, witnesses, and frontline service providers. Fourth, ensuring safe, rapid, and unimpeded humanitarian access and comprehensive psychosocial services is vital. Survivors should have timely access to comprehensive health care, including sexual and reproductive health services, psychosocial support, legal assistance, livelihood opportunities, and long-term socio-economic reintegrations. Children born of conflict-related rape also deserve equal protections, legal recognitions, and opportunities to live free from stigma and any discriminations. The member states, humanitarian partners, and UN should strengthen coordinations with national and local actors in this respect. Finally, strengthen global cooperations and adequate financing are essential to sustain prevention and response efforts. Without stronger political will and sustained financial resources, global commitments cannot turn into protective shields. The international community must significantly scale up support for survivors-centered services, ensuring access to sexual and reproductive health care, psychosocial and legal assistance, and socio-economic reintegrations. Mr. President, Nepal has been a proactive promoter of women, peace, and security agenda. Nepal has achieved significant progress in advancing WPS agenda, including through the meaningful participation of women in governance. The second WPS National Action Plan, adopted in 2022, incorporates the concerns of sexual violence survivors, female combatants, and children born of wartime rape. Following the 2026 signing of the Comprehensive Peace Accord, Nepal is pursuing conflict-related sexual violence cases to ensure accountability for perpetrators and access to justice with reparations for survivors. It is one of the largest troop and police contributing countries to the UN peacekeeping. Nepal remains committed to enhancing the participation of women peacekeepers, preventing and strengthening their role on the protections of civilians and the prevention of conflict-related sexual violence. In conclusion, Mr. President, preventing conflict-related sexual violence requires strong political will and an unwavering commitment to prioritize the agenda, uphold international humanitarian and human rights law, ensure accountability for perpetrators, invest in early warning and prevention mechanisms, empower women and girls as agents of peace and security, and sustain international cooperation and support. Let's work together to end the scores of conflict-related sexual violence and provide every survivor the hope, justice, and agency they need. I thank you.
Je remercie le représentant du Népal pour sa présentation. Je donne à présent la parole à la représentante de la République bolivarienne du Venezuela.
Gracias, señor presidente. Venezuela agradece la convocatoria y reafirma que honrar la promesa del derecho internacional hacia los sobrevivientes de violencia sexual relacionada con conflictos es una obligación colectiva que emana del marco jurídico internacional, del mandato del Consejo de Seguridad y de los compromisos asumidos por los Estados en la agenda de mujeres, paz y seguridad. La violencia sexual sin distinción de género no solo atenta contra la dignidad humana, sino que es una violación flagrante de los derechos humanos y del derecho internacional humanitario, a través de la táctica intolerable de guerra, terror y represión que condenamos y que debe ser erradicada mediante acciones soberanas contundentes y una cooperación internacional genuina. Para hacer cumplir el marco normativo existente, es fundamental el fortalecimiento de los sistemas jurídicos nacionales. No puede haber prevención ni rendición de cuentas efectiva sin soberanía institucional. Es imperativo armonizar las legislaciones internas para cerrar las brechas de impunidad y garantizar que esa rendición se traduzca en reparaciones transformadoras y entornos seguros para los sobrevivientes. Se requiere que el tema de las consecuencias de la violencia sexual esté contemplado en los procesos de paz y el alto al fuego, así como en todos los procesos de desmovilización y reintegración en los que participen Naciones Unidas. Los mediadores y enviados especiales vinculados a estos procesos deben contar en el terreno con la capacitación y experticia necesaria para abordar debidamente el tema, según los contextos específicos. En Venezuela hemos consolidado un robusto andamiaje legal e institucional, destacando la Ley Orgánica sobre el Derecho de las Mujeres a una Vida Libre de Violencia, que establece la prevención, atención, sanción y erradicación de la violencia contra las mujeres en cualquiera de sus manifestaciones, junto con programas de vanguardia como la Gran Misión Venezuela Mujer, la Gran Misión Parto Humanizado y el Plan Nacional de Derechos Sexuales y Reproductivos, todos orientados a la salud, protección y autonomía económica de las poblaciones más vulnerables. Señor presidente, Denunciamos que la aplicación de las medidas coercitivas unilaterales asfixia a las economías locales y debilita los sistemas de salud y justicia y revictimiza a los sobrevivientes al privarlas de recursos esenciales, por lo que exigimos su levantamiento inmediato. Asimismo, sostenemos que los regímenes de sanciones de este Consejo deben utilizarse exclusiva y estrictamente para disuadir a los perpetradores directos y jamás derivar en castigos colectivos que afecten el tejido social de una nación entera. Para concluir, es imperativo demostrar voluntad política real para fortalecer las instituciones nacionales y garantizar tanto la seguridad como la dignidad de las víctimas sobrevivientes a fin de reintegrarse plena y productivamente a la sociedad. Muchas gracias.
Je remercie la représentante du Venezuela pour sa déclaration. Je donne à présent la parole à la représentante du Monténégro.
Thank you, Mr. President. Montenegro aligns itself with the statement by the EU and Canada on behalf of Group of Friends of WPS. We thank the Presidency for convening this important debate and express our appreciation to the Special Representative for her detailed briefing, as well as to the representative of civil society for the valuable insights shared today. The Secretary General report presents a deeply alarming picture. In 2025 alone, the UN verified nearly 10,000 cases of conflict-related sexual violence, more than double the number recorded in 2024. Women and girls accounted for 92% of verified victims, reminding us that they continue to bear the heaviest burden of these crimes. The report also reminds us that conflict-related sexual violence continues to have a devastating effect on civilians around the world. Behind the statistics are people whose lives have been violated, future altered, and whose path to recovery is often long and difficult. Montenegro strongly condemns all forms of conflict-related sexual violence, regardless of where they occur or who commits them. These crimes can never be accepted as an inevitable consequence of conflict. We remain particularly concerned by the continued reports of conflict-related sexual violence in Ukraine. All allegations must be thoroughly investigated, perpetrators brought to justice, and survivors provided with the support they need. There can be no lasting peace without accountability. Accountability also starts at home. Montenegro continues to strengthen its response to war crimes, including CRSV. In 2025, our courts delivered the country's first convictions for conflict-related sexual violence. 2 additional proceedings are currently underway, while further investigations continue. Although these steps cannot undo the suffering of victims, they send a clear message that these crimes will not be ignored. Justice, however, is only part of the response. Survivors must also have access to healthcare, psychosocial support, legal assistance, and protection. At a time when needs continue to grow and gender-based violence is on the rise, we are deeply concerned by the reduction in funding for these essential services and prevention programs. Mr. President, on June 19th, we marked the International Day for the Elimination of Sexual Violence in Conflict. Preventing and eradicating conflict-related sexual violence is our obligation under the international law. Montenegro reaffirms its commitment to addressing these crimes, ensuring accountability, and supporting survivors and their communities. Thank you.
Je remercie la représentante du Monténégro. Je donne à présent la parole à la représentante du Maroc.
Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président. Le Royaume du Maroc tient à remercier la République démocratique du Congo pour l'organisation de ce débat ouvert dans le cadre de sa présidence du Conseil de sécurité et à exprimer sa sincère appréciation à son Excellence Madame la Première ministre pour avoir personnellement présidé cette séance. Sa présence à cette tribune est un signal fort et un geste de solidarité envers toutes les survivantes et tous les survivants dont la voix mérite d'être entendue dans cette salle. Le Maroc remercie également la représentante spéciale du secrétaire général pour ses briefings constants, son engagement sans relâche et pour le travail remarquable conduit par son équipe. Monsieur le Président, plus de 25 ans après la résolution 1325 et plus de 15 ans après la résolution 1888, le rapport du secrétaire général pour 2026 ne dresse pas un bilan de progrès elle dresse un constat d'urgence. Le Maroc partage ses préoccupations et estime que l'écart entre les engagements normatifs et la réalité vécue par les survivantes appelle une réponse collective à la hauteur de la gravité de la situation. Monsieur le Président, le Royaume du Maroc s'est engagé de longue date sur cette thématique, convaincu que la lutte contre les violences sexuelles liées au conflit est indissociable de la promotion de la paix et de la sécurité internationale. En tant que contributeur aux opérations de maintien de la paix des Nations Unies, avec près de 3400 casques bleus déployés, dont 120 femmes, le Maroc veille à ce que ces contingents intègrent pleinement les impératifs de protection des civils, et en particulier des femmes et des filles. Le Maroc est par ailleurs partie aux principaux instruments internationaux relatifs aux droits des femmes et au droit international humanitaire et soutient activement les efforts de la communauté internationale pour renforcer les mécanismes de la prévention, de protection et de redevabilité. En tant que membre du groupe des amis des femmes, de la paix et de la sécurité, le Maroc a réaffirmé à plusieurs reprises sa condamnation de toutes les formes de violences sexuelles liées au conflit et son soutien au mandat de la représentante spéciale. Monsieur le Président, le Maroc souhaite insister sur 3 impératifs. Le premier est celui de la redevabilité. L'architecture normative construite par ce Conseil est solide, mais il n'a pas de sens si elle se traduit par des conséquences réelles pour les auteurs de ces crimes. L'impunité n'est pas une fatalité, c'est un choix politique que la communauté internationale a le pouvoir et la responsabilité de ne plus tolérer. Le deuxième impératif est celui des ressources. La protection des survivantes et le déploiement des conseillères pour la protection des femmes requièrent un financement durable, prévisible et à la hauteur de l'ampleur du défi. Le troisième impératif est celui de centrage sur les survivantes. Les femmes et les filles ne doivent pas être uniquement au centre des constats, elles doivent être au cœur des solutions, co-créatrices des politiques qui les concernent et pleinement intégrées au processus de paix, de justice et de rétablissement. À cet égard, le Maroc formule 3 propositions concrètes. Premièrement, sur les sanctions. Le Maroc appelle à une application plus rigoureuse et systématique du critère de violence sexuelle lié au conflit dans les régimes de sanctions existants, naturellement sur la base d'informations vérifiées et crédibles. Deuxièmement, sur la protection des survivantes. Le Maroc appelle à garantir un accès rapide à une prise en charge médicale, psychosociale et juridique intégrée, incluant une attention particulière à l'enregistrement et à l'identité juridique des enfants nés de viol, ainsi qu'à la protection effective des acteurs de terrain contre les représailles. Troisièmement, sur les services essentiels de l'ONU. Le Maroc appelle à préserver, y compris en période de contraintes budgétaires, le financement des services vitaux destinés aux survivantes, notamment ceux de la santé. Monsieur le Président, pour conclure, le Maroc réaffirme son soutien indéfectible au secrétaire général et à la représentante spéciale dans l'exercice de leur mandat et son attachement à l'ensemble des cadres normatifs que ce Conseil a patiemment construit. Honorer la promesse du droit international aux survivantes, pour reprendre des termes de ce débat, ce n'est pas simplement une obligation juridique, mais une obligation morale, collective et urgente, à laquelle le Maroc entend contribuer avec constance et détermination. Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président.
Je remercie la représentante du Maroc. Je donne à présent la parole au représentant du Zimbabwe.
Thank you, Mr. President. Zimbabwe congratulates the Democratic Republic of the Congo on its assumption of the presidency of the Security Council for the month of July 2026 and wishes you every success in guiding the Council's work. We commend the DRC for convening this important debate and thank Prime Minister Judith Suminwa Tuluka for her leadership during this session. We also thank the Special Representative Pramila Patten and the civil society briefer for carrying the voices of the survivors into this chamber. The Secretary General's report is a summons to conscience. It records a sharp rise in verified cases of conflict-related sexual violence in 2025, marked by extreme brutality, overwhelmingly directed against women and girls. Behind every case is not a statistic, but a life wounded, a family shaken, and a community scarred. The Council has spoken clearly so many times before. Resolution 1820 recognized that sexual violence may be used as a tactic of war to humiliate, dominate, instill fear in, disperse, and or forcibly relocate civilians. Resolution 1960 reaffirmed that such violence, when used as a tactic of war or as part of a widespread or systematic attack, can significantly exacerbate and prolong situations of armed conflict. Resolution 2467, therefore, demands the complete cessation with immediate effect of all acts of sexual violence by parties to conflict. The question before us then is whether our words will be matched by action. International law must not be a distant promise to survivors. It must be a present shield, a path to justice, and a bridge to dignity. Zimbabwe therefore adds its voice in support of victims by calling for 5 practical steps. First, parties to conflict must issue orders prohibiting sexual violence backed by discipline and prosecution. Secondly, ceasefire, peace, and security arrangements must explicitly prohibit conflict-related sexual violence, exclude such crimes from amnesties, and include survivor-sensitive monitoring. Thirdly, member states and United Nations missions should preserve evidence, strengthen national investigation and prosecution capacity, and apply sanctions where persistent perpetrators defy Council demands. Fourthly, survivors must have safe, non-discriminatory access to medical care, psychosocial support, legal aid, socio-economic reintegration, and reparations. Fifthly, women protection advisors and women-led and survivor-led organizations must be funded, including during mission transitions. Mr. President, Council must send one message. The body of a woman, girl, man, or boy is not a battlefield. Survivors have waited long enough. The law must now reach them where they are. I thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie le représentant du Zimbabwe pour sa déclaration. Je donne à présent la parole au représentant de l'Ukraine.
Mr. President, Ukraine thanks the Democratic Republic of the Congo for convening this very important open debate. We also thank the Under-Secretary General, Ms. Pramila Patten, and Ms. Carine Jocelyn for their presentations. Russia's aggression against Ukraine has brought back to the European continent a myriad of war crimes that many believed belonged to the darkest chapters of history. Yet among this catalog of atrocities, conflict-related sexual violence stands apart through its particular cruelty and depravity. These crimes are designed to strip victims of dignity, terrorize entire communities, and ultimately break the will of the entire nation. This year's Secretary General report leaves no room for ambiguity. Conflict-related sexual violence has become woven into the fabric of Russia's modus operandi. It is inflicted deliberately, systematically, and with a clear purpose to humiliate, dominate, and destroy. The aggressor state has institutionalized sexual violence as a method of torture in places of detention throughout the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine and inside Russia itself. Victims include prisoners of war, abducted and illegally detained Ukrainian civilians who are held in penal colonies, secret detention facilities, and so-called filtration camps. These crimes they describe upon liberation are almost beyond language. Rape, gang rape, rape with objects, forced nudity, genital mutilation, castration. Approximately 80% of Ukrainian men released from Russian captivity report the use of electric shocks applied to the genital area. Prisoners are forced to confess to crimes they never committed. Some confess simply to gain the opportunity to hear the voice of a loved one or merely to survive another day. While men constitute the overwhelming majority of documented victims, women have been subjected to these crimes as well. Numerous international mechanisms have documented rape, including with batons and other objects, repeated and collective rapes committed against female prisoners of war, Ukrainian detainees and civilian women in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. These crimes inflict wounds that will continue to haunt survivors, their families, and entire communities. These crimes are also committed not by an outlaw militia beyond the reach of the international law. They are committed by the Russian Federation, a state that occupies, although unlawfully, the seat of a permanent member of this very council. Ukraine welcomes the Secretary General's decision to list the Russian armed and security forces among parties that systematically engage in conflict-related sexual violence. Russia is now listed under both the Children and Armed Conflict and the CRSV mandate. But listing cannot become merely another entry in another UN report. As the Secretary General rightly recalls in one of his reports, state actors repeatedly listed should not participate in UN peacekeeping operations. This principle was further reinforced by numerous UN Security Council resolutions, and we count on resolute action to ensure its full implementation. Accountability also requires exposing the full scale of these crimes. Secretary General's annual report documents hundreds of CRSV cases despite Russia's almost complete denial of access to places of detention or temporarily occupied territories. If this is what the world knows without access, just imagine what remains hidden. The international community must not normalize Russia's obstruction. Every denied visit, every unanswered request must be met with stronger international pressure. Ukraine, on its part, continues to provide comprehensive access to independent international monitors throughout the territory under its control. The aggressor state must be held to the same standard. Mr. President, as of today, Ukrainian law enforcement authorities have registered around 400 cases of conflict-related sexual violence in the context of Russian aggression. These figures are only the tip of the iceberg. Because of stigma, trauma, fear, and victim blaming, it is estimated that only about 1 in 10 survivors is willing or able to report these crimes. In this context, Ukraine highly values its cooperation with the Special Representative Pramila Patten and her office, and especially a team of experts on the rule of law and sexual violence in conflict. Over the past years, this cooperation has evolved into a truly comprehensive, multidimensional, and results-oriented partnership. Together, we have strengthened Ukraine's legislation, enhanced prosecutorial and investigative capacities, embedded survivor-centered and trauma-informed approaches throughout our justice system, improved access to legal aid, delivered extensive trainings, and developed Ukraine's interim reparation framework for survivors. This partnership demonstrates that what can be achieved when UN expertise meets national determination. We look forward to further building on these achievements. Ukraine will also continue to ensure that every allegation of CRSV is thoroughly investigated, every survivor is heard, and every perpetrator is brought to justice. Only by confronting the truth in its entirety can we dismantle impunity and lay the foundation of a just and lasting peace based on unwavering respect for international law. I thank you.
Je remercie le représentant de l'Ukraine pour sa déclaration. Je donne à présent la parole à la représentante du Cap-Vert.
Thank you, President. Cabo Verde expresses its deepest appreciation towards Her Excellency, Madam Prime Minister, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo for convening this important open debate. We also thank the Special Representative of the Secretary General, Ms. Pramila Patten, and Ms. Carine Jocelyn for their valuable insights. Conflict-related sexual violence remains one of the gravest violations of international humanitarian and human rights law. It is used as a tactic of war, terror, and repression, leaving profound physical, physiological, and social consequences for the survivors, their families, and entire communities. Women and girls continue to bear the heaviest burden, although men, boys, and persons of diverse backgrounds are also affected. For Cabo Verde, honoring the promise of international law begins with placing survivors at the center of every response. Survivors must not be seen solely as victims, but as right holders and essential partners in designing policies, justice processes, and recovery efforts. Their dignity, agency, and informed choices must guide our collective action. Justice is indispensable to prevention. Perpetrators of conflict-related sexual violence must be held accountable through credible national and international mechanisms. Ending impunity is not only a legal obligation, but also a deterrent against future violations. We therefore support strengthening investigative capacities, preserving evidence, ensuring survivor-centered judicial processes, and making full use of the tools available to the Security Council, including sanctions where appropriate and consistent with international law. Prevention requires sustained political commitment and investment. We must strengthen early warning, integrate conflict-related sexual violence considerations across peace operations, mediation, and peace-building efforts, and ensure that mission transitions do not create protection gaps that leave women and girls at even greater risk. Women's protection advisors, women peace builders, and local women's organizations play an indispensable role and should receive predictable political and financial support. We are equally concerned that growing humanitarian needs and financial constraints are reducing access to essential services for survivors. Comprehensive health care, including sexual and reproductive health services, psychosocial support, legal assistance, education, and economic reintegration are not optional. They are fundamental components of the recovery, resilience, and lasting peace. Mr. President, the Women, Peace and Security agenda reminds us that sustainable peace cannot be achieved without the full, equal, and meaningful participation of women at every stage of conflict prevention, peace processes, and post-conflict recovery. Investing in women's leadership is therefore not only a matter of justice, but also of more effective peace building. Let us therefore renew our collective determination to translate the Security Council's normative framework into concrete protection for those who need it most. Survivors deserve much more than our solidarity. They deserve justice, protection, reparations, and the opportunity to rebuild their lives with dignity. Thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie la représentante du Cap-Vert pour sa déclaration. Je passe maintenant la parole à la représentante du Kirghizistan.
Excellencies, at the outset, we would like to thank the Democratic Republic of the Congo for convening today's open debate. Conflict-related sexual violence remains one of the gravest violations of international humanitarian and human rights law. It leaves profound and lasting consequences for individuals, families, and societies. Such crimes inflict profound physical and psychological harm on survivors, devastate families and communities, and undermine prospects for lasting peace and reconciliation. In Kyrgyzstan, we continue to strengthen our legal and institutional framework to combat sexual violence, protect victims, and ensure accountability. At the same time, our humanitarian efforts to repatriate and reintegrate more than 500 Kyrgyz citizens, primarily women and children from conflict zones, have reinforced our understanding that recovery requires far more than physical return. It requires coordinated legal, psychological, medical, and social support, as well as sustained efforts to help people rebuild their lives and reintegrate into the local communities. The experience of my country demonstrates that addressing the consequences of armed conflict requires a comprehensive and human-centered approach. Our experience also highlights the importance of preventive efforts. We must strengthen awareness of the absolute unacceptability of sexual violence in conflict, challenge harmful stereotypes and stigma faced by survivors, and promote education that fosters respect for human dignity and equality. Mr. President, our response to conflict-related sexual violence must begin with accountability. The international community has established a strong framework through international humanitarian law, international human rights law, and the Security Council's resolution on women, peace and security and conflict-related sexual violence. Our collective task is to ensure their full, consistent, and effective implementation based on the principle of impartiality. This requires strengthening national capacities, enhancing international cooperation, supporting survivor-centered approach, and ending impunity for perpetrators. Equally important is ensuring comprehensive support for survivors. Access to medical care, psychological services, legal assistance, and long-term reintegration should be available without discrimination and tailored to the specific needs of survivors. In this regard, local communities often play an indispensable role and deserve sustained support. Finally, we should continue to ensure that survivors are not viewed solely as beneficiaries of assistance, but as partners whose perspectives can help shape more effective policies and responses. Kyrgyzstan looks forward to contributing constructively to advancing the women, peace and security agenda, including efforts to prevent and respond to conflict-related sexual violence. I thank you.
Je remercie la représentante du Kirghizistan pour sa déclaration. Il reste un certain nombre d'orateurs inscrits sur ma liste pour la présente séance. Si les membres du Conseil sont d'accord, je me propose de suspendre la séance jusqu'à vendredi matin, à la suite de la séance déjà programmée. La séance est suspendue.